But if you look carefully at all my legislation, I have offered a free market alternative to this, to allow the doctors to negotiate, to make contracts, get them out from under the monopoly control laws, give tax deductions for insurance policy where there's no fault insurance. And there is a way in the private market. Today, we can't contract with our patients for a third-party third-party settlement. And that takes it out of the market, turns it over to the attorneys. If they accept my position on this, a free market approach, and not a nationalized tort law control of this, believe me, we'd put all the trial lawyers out of business and they wouldn't get most of the money that comes from all these lawsuits when they're suing doctors.
Would you let the country go into default, which all the experts agree will only make continued borrowing even more expensive for the U.S. government, and you want to cut government spending, you say, by 50%, eliminating everything from the Federal Reserve to the Department of Homeland Security? Yeah, under your plan, what would you leave for the federal government to do?
Yeah, it's sort of like to follow the Constitution, and then we wouldn't have these kind of problems. No, you have a government that provides national defense, but you don't have militarism and you police the world. Maybe we could take care of some people back here at home if we weren't spending $1.5 trillion a year on our militarism. That money needs to be spent back at home, and we would have more defense, not less defense. So I don't see why we should raise the national debt. You say, well, default. Probably not. They have money coming in. They can patch it over and pay it, but that's the only way they're going to get a message. But it's nothing new. Our country has defaulted 3 different times. They promised at one time during the Civil War to pay in gold. They refused to. In the 30s, they promised to pay in gold. They refused to. And then in 1971, they promised to pay foreigners in gold. We defaulted, and we stuck it to them. So once again, we're going to default. We're defaulting every single day. That's what your prices are doing. Prices go up, they're defaulting on your money. So we need to look at the Federal Reserve System.
Sure, they can do whatever they want and call it whatever they want. Are you advocating legalizing gay marriage in this country?
Well, matter of fact, I spent a whole chapter in a new book I've written on marriage. And I think it's very important, and seeing that I've been married for 53, 54 years now. But I think the government should just be out of it. I think it should be done by the church or private contract, and we shouldn't have this argument. Who's married and who isn't married? I have my standards, but I shouldn't have to impose my standards on others. So, no, the union wage is an artificial wage mandated by the government under the National Labor Relations Board. The whole thing is unconstitutional. They shouldn't be telling people where to go. The Interstate Commerce Clause should be there to facilitate and allow people to move their businesses back and forth and not to inhibit business decisions. They will if they understand my defense of liberty is the defense of their right to practice their religion and say their prayers where they want and practice their life. But if you do not protect liberty across the board, it's a First Amendment type issue. We don't have a First Amendment so that we can talk about the weather. We have the First Amendment so we can say very controversial things. So for people to say that, yes, we have our religious beliefs protected, but people who want to follow something else or a controversial religion, you can't do this. If you have the inconsistency, then you're really not defending liberty. But there are strict rules on freedom of choice of this sort, because you can't hurt other people, you can't defame other people, but yes, you have a right to do things that are very controversial. If not, you're going to end up with government that's going to tell us what we can eat and drink and whatever. You know, it's amazing that we want freedom to pick the future, you know, our future in a spiritual way, but not when it comes to our personal habits.
Are you suggesting that heroin and prostitution are an exercise of liberty?
Well, you know, I probably never used those words. You put those words someplace, but yes, in essence, if I leave it to the states, it's going to be up to the states. Up until this past century, you know, for over 100 years they were legal. What you're inferring is, you know what? If we legalized heroin tomorrow, everybody's going to use heroin. How many people here would use heroin if it was legal? I bet nobody would put the hand, oh yeah, I need the government to take care of me. I don't want to use heroin, so I need these laws.
I never thought heroin would get applause here in South Carolina.
Congressman Paul, a lot of folks consider you the founding father of the Tea Party movement. Now, Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann has founded and heads up the Tea Party caucus in the House. Has she eclipsed you?
Well, she's not here tonight, so she hasn't quite done that. We attend Tea Party meetings together, and of course the Tea Party movement was started during the last campaign when there was a special day where they raised $6 million spontaneously, and that was the beginning of it. But no, I don't feel threatened.
Thanks.
I am Congressman Ron Paul. I've been elected to the Congress 12 times from Texas. Before I went into the Congress, I delivered babies for a living and delivered 4,000 babies. Now I would like to be known and defend the title that I am the champion of liberty and I defend the Constitution. Boy, that's a tough question. No, I can't think of anything, but may I answer the question that you alluded to before about whether or not 5% is too optimistic? No, there's nothing wrong without setting a goal of 5 or 10 or 15% if you have a free market economy. We're trying to unwind a Keynesian bubble that's been going on for 70 years, and you're not going to touch this problem until you liquidate the bad debt and the malinvestment, go back to work. But you have to have sound money. You have to recognize how we got into trouble. We got into trouble because we had a financial bubble, and it's caused by the Federal Reserve. If you don't look at monetary policy, we will continue the trend of the last decade. We haven't developed any new jobs in the last decade. Matter of fact, we've had 30 million new people and no new jobs. It's because the people don't understand monetary policy and central economic planning. Free markets will give you 10 or 15% growth or whatever, and you will not have to turn it off because you think it's going to cause inflation. It doesn't work that way.
I'm going to jump in.
Pretty important, because everything we've done in the last 20 or 30 years, we've exported our jobs. And when you have a reserve currency of the world and you abuse it, you export money. That becomes the main export, so it goes with the money. You have to invite capital. The way you get capital into a country, you have to have a strong currency, not a weak currency. Today, it's a deliberate job of the Federal Reserve to weaken our currency. We should invite capital back. First thing is we have trillions of dollars, at least over $1 trillion of U.S. money made overseas, but it stays over there because if they bring it home, they get taxed. If you want to, we need to get the Fed to quit printing the money, and if you want capital, you have to entice those individuals to repatriate their money and take the taxes off us, set up a financial system, deregulate and de-tax, to invite people to go back to work again. But as long as we run a program of deliberately weakening our currency, our jobs will go overseas, and that is what's happened for a good many years, especially in the last decade.
Governor Pawlenty, does the congressman have it right?
The federal, Congressman Paul, this is for you. The federal government now assists many industries. Green jobs, the auto industry, research and development, all get subsidies. Given the current state of the economy, what standards do you have, if any, for government assistance to private enterprise?
Well, there shouldn't be any government assistance to private enterprise. It's not morally correct. It's not legal. It's bad economics. It's not part of the Constitution. If you allow any, but when the politicians get in and direct things, you get the malinvestment. They do the dumb things. They might build too many houses, and they might not direct their research to the right places. So, no, it's a fallacy to think that government and politicians and bureaucrats are smart enough to manage the economy, so it shouldn't happen. I would want to do much less, much sooner. The government shouldn't be involved. When you take the bankruptcies, we've been doing a whole lot. We've been propping them up. We've had the Federal Reserve buy all the illiquid assets which were worthless, stick it with the taxpayers. People who made the money when the bubble was being blown up, they're the ones who got bailed out. But you want the correction. Corrections are good. The malinvestment and the bubbles are caused by the Federal Reserve and the government, and we keep propping it up. And that's why this is going. It was predictable it would come. It's predictable it's lasted 3 years, and it's predictable as long as we do what we're doing in Washington, it's going to last another 10 years. We're doing what we did in the Depression. We are doing what the Japanese have done. You need to get the prices of houses down to clear the market, but they're trying to keep the prices up. Or actually have programs in Washington. We're stimulating housing. You need to clear the market, and then we can all go back to work. But what we're doing now is absolutely wrong.
Let me give you another topic. What's your question, sir?
Yes, sir. As a member of the baby boomer generation. I've been contributing to Medicare through payroll taxes for over 30 years. How do you propose to keep Medicare financially solvent for the next 50 years and beyond?
Let's start with Dr. Paul on this one.
Well, under today's conditions, it's not solvent and won't be solvent. You know, if you're an average couple and you paid your entire amount into Medicare, you would have put $140,000 into it. And in your lifetime, you will take out more than 3 times that much. So a little bit of arithmetic tells you it's not solvent. So we're up against the wall on that. So it can't be made solvent. It has to change. We have to have more competition in medicine. And I would think that if we don't want to cut any of the medical benefits for children or the elderly, because we have drawn so many in and got them so dependent on the government, if you want to work a transition, you have to cut a lot of money. And that's why I argue the case that this money ought to be cut out of foreign welfare and foreign militarism and corporate welfare and the military-industrial complex. Then we might have enough money to tide people over. But some revamping has to occur. What we need is competition. We need to get a chance for the people to opt out of the system. Just to talk about opting out of Obamacare, why can't we opt out of the whole system and take care of ourselves?
All right, let's continue the conversation. Governor Pawlenty? Congressman Paul says opt out.
What makes America work?
Congressman Paul, does faith have a role in these public issues, the public square, or is it a personal issue at your home and in your church?
I think faith has something to do with the character of the people who represent us. And law should have a moral fiber to it, and our leaders should. We shouldn't expect us to try to change morality. You can't teach people how to be moral. But the Constitution addresses this by saying, literally it says no theocracy, but it doesn't talk about church and state. The most important thing is the First Amendment. The Congress shall write no laws, which means Congress should never prohibit the expression of your Christian faith in a public place. But on coming in, you know, there was a time when government we didn't depend on government for everything. There was a time when the Catholic Church actually looked at them.
Should they get care? Should taxpayers have to pay for that care?
No, they should not be forced to, but we shouldn't be penalizing the Catholic Church because they're trying to fulfill a role, and some of the anti-immigrants want to come down hard on the Catholic Church, and that is wrong. If we believed in our free society, matter of fact, this whole immigration problem is related to the economy. People aren't coming over as much now because it's weak. When we had a healthy economy, some of our people did work and people flowed over here getting jobs. So there is an economic issue here as well. But no, if you have an understanding and you want to believe in freedom, freedom has solved these kind of problems before. You don't have to say, oh, you're not going to have care, there won't be any care, and everybody's going to starve to death and die on the streets without medical care. That's the implication of the question. That's just not true, and you shouldn't accept it. No, we shouldn't have that power given to the government where they can take private land and transfer it to a private industry. The eminent domain laws are going to vary in different states, but we have the national eminent domain laws. It was never meant to take it from some people, private owners, and then take it and give it to a corporation because it's going to help in that local locality. And this goes back to the basic understanding of property rights. Property in a free society should be owned by the people, and it shouldn't be regulated to death by the governments, whether it's Washington, D.C. or local governments. Right now, we really don't own our land. We just pay rent on our land, and we listen to all these regulations. So I would say the courts should get out of the way, too. They should not have this right to take land from individuals to provide privileges for another group.
Thank you.
Congressman Paul, do you agree with that position?
Not quite. You know, I served 5 years in the military. I've had a little experience. I've spent a little bit of time over in the Pakistan, Afghanistan area, as well as in Iran. But I wouldn't wait for my generals. I'm the commander-in-chief. I make the decisions. I tell the generals what to do, and I'd bring them home as quickly as possible, and I'd get them out of Iraq as well, and I wouldn't start a war in Libya. I'd quit bombing Yemen, and I'd quit bombing Pakistan. I'd start taking care of people here at home because we could save hundreds of billions of dollars. Our national security is not enhanced by our presence over there. We have no purpose there. We should learn the lessons of history, and the longer we're there, the worse things are and the more danger we're in as well, because our presence there is not making friends, let me tell you.
Governor.
Join the administration?
Yes.
Oh, I would think everybody would qualify as...
You only get to pick one. It's about choices.
I have to pick one. Well, let me look them over. I would have to do a bit more quizzing. I would have to check. They haven't even told me how they feel about the Federal Reserve yet. They haven't told me about a non-expensive foreign policy. So I'll have to do some more quizzing. Well, they didn't downgrade it mainly because they couldn't come to a conclusion. They couldn't come to a conclusion because they didn't know what was going on. The country's bankrupt and nobody wanted to admit it. And when you're bankrupt, you can't keep spending. And all these proposed cuts weren't cuts at all. What you have to do is restore sound money. You have to understand why you have a business cycle, why you have booms and busts. If you don't do that, there's no way you can solve these problems. And the booms and busts comes from a failed monetary system. The interest rates that are way lower than they should be encourages malinvestment and debt. And to get out of that, all this other tinkering, you cannot do that unless you liquidate debt. You don't bail out the people that are bankrupt and dump the debt on the people. That is what's happened. So you have to allow liquidation of debt, eliminate the malinvestment, then you go back and you can get growth again by having a better tax structure, lower taxes, invite capital back into this country, get a lot less regulations, and under those conditions you can have growth again.
And you can get it through a divided Congress.
You have to get it through a divided Congress. But the one thing is, if you approach it constitutionally, if you approach it on the principles of liberty, you can bring people together. If we have to cut, maybe we wouldn't be so determined that you can't cut one nickel out of the militarism around the world. Neither the Democrats or the Republicans want to cut that. So if you want to cut, you have to put the militarism on the table as well. I don't like putting the burden on our businessmen to be the policeman. That means he has to be a policing activity. And I also resent the fact that illegals come into this country and they do have problems, but if a church helps them and feeds them, we don't blame the church, or at least we shouldn't in a free society. But I have a strong position on immigration. I don't think that we should give amnesty and they become voters, but I do think we should deal with our borders. But one way that I would suggest that we could do it is pay a lot less attention to the borders between Afghanistan and Iraq and Pakistan, and bring our troops home and deal with the border. But why do we pay more attention to the borders overseas and less attention to the borders here at home? We now we have a mess on the borders, and it has a lot more to do with it than just immigration, because we're financing some of this militarism against the drug dealers on the borders right now to the tune of over $1 billion. And there is a mess down there, but it's much bigger than just the immigration problem. But I do not believe in giving entitlements to illegal immigrants at all, and there should be no mandates on the states to make them do it. But we have big trouble in this medical care problem, and we have drifted so far from any of our care being delivered by the marketplace. And once you get the government involved, and both parties have done it, they've developed a bit of a medical care delivery system based on corporatism. The corporations are doing quite well, whether it's Obama or under the Republicans. The drug companies do well, the insurance companies do well, the organized medicine do well, the management companies do well. The patient and the doctors suffer. There's a wedge. Every time you hit the government get in here with these regulations and have these mandates, there's a wedge driven in between the doctor and the patient. We have to get the people more control of their care, and that's why these medical savings accounts could at least introduce the notion of market delivery of medical care. Well, maybe you didn't want to face up to the challenge, for all we know.
Are you worried about this strategy?
Oh, no, I'm very pleased that he's coming in, because he represents the status quo, and I feel like I'm sort of separated from the other candidates with my strong belief in liberty and limited government and a different foreign policy, and want to deal with the Fed, so he'll just dilute all their votes.
Okay. Mr. Kane, what about...
Congressman Paul, you say that President Obama is not too soft on Iran. You say that he is too tough on Iran. I want to put up some of your statements. Sanctions are not diplomacy, you say. They are a precursor to war and an embarrassment to a country that pays lip service to free trade. As for Iran's nuclear ambitions, you wrote this: "One can understand why they might want to become nuclear capable, if only to defend themselves and to be treated more respectfully." Is that your policy towards Iran?
Well, even our own CIA gives me this information that they have no evidence that they're working on a weapon. Just think of what we went through in the Cold War when I was in the Air Force, after I was drafted in the Air Force, all through the 60s. We were standing up against the Soviets. They had like 30,000 nuclear weapons with intercontinental missiles. Just think of the agitation and the worrying of a country that might get a nuclear weapon someday, and just think of how many nuclear weapons surround Iran. The Chinese are there, the Indians are there, the Pakistanis are there, the Israelis are there, the United States is there. All these countries. China has nuclear weapons. Why wouldn't it be natural that they might want a weapon? There'd be, internationally, they'd be given more respect. Why should we write people off? There was, in the 50s, we at least talked to them. At least our leaders and Reagan talked to the Soviets. What's so terribly bad about this? And countries that you put sanctions on, you are more likely to fight them. I say a policy of peace is free trade, stay out of their internal business, don't get involved in these wars, and just bring our troops home.
Congressman Paul, I want to just give you 15 seconds. I want to just make sure I understand. So your policy towards Iran is if they want to develop a nuclear weapon, that's their right, no sanctions, no effort to stop them.
No, I think that makes it much worse. Why would that be so strange? If the Soviets and the Chinese have nuclear weapons, we tolerated the Soviets. We didn't attack them, and they were a much greater danger. They were the greatest danger to us in our whole history. But you don't go to war against them. I mean, this whole idea of sanctions, all these pretend free traders, they're the ones who put on these trade sanctions. This is why we still don't have trade relationships with Cuba. It's about time we talk to Cuba and stop fighting these wars that are about 30 or 40 years old.
Mr. Kaine, Senator Santorum, I got a question for you.
Well, as the author of the Iran Freedom Support Act, which he is criticizing, because I authored it when I was in the United States Senate when it actually imposed sanctions on Iran because of their nuclear program. Iran is not Iceland, Ron. Iran is a country that has been at war with us since 1979. Iran is a country that has killed more American men and women in uniform in Iraq and Afghanistan than the Iraqis and the Afghanistan has had. The Iranians are the existential threat to the state of Israel. You ask the Israelis, what keeps them up at night? It's the Iranians funding of Hamas and Hezbollah and the support of Syria.
30 seconds.
And the reason, hold on, let me finish.
There are rules here, sir.
Yeah, I know there are rules, and you guys have been giving these guys a lot of time and not a whole lot of time to me, so let me answer the question.
You have a question coming.
Okay. The senator is wrong on his history. We've been at war in Iran for a lot longer than 79. We started it in 1953 when we sent in a coup, installed the Shah, and the reaction, the blowback came in.
Congressman Paul says terrorism suspects have committed a crime and are should be given due process in civilian courts. Could you please tell Congressman Paul why he's wrong?
Well, because simply terrorists who commit acts against United States citizens, people who are from foreign countries who do that, do not have any right under our Constitution to Miranda rights. We've also seen that Guantanamo Bay has yielded significant information. In fact, we've learned that led to the capture and the killing of bin Laden. This is a tool that we need to have in order to be able to prosecute the new type of war, the new type of warfare, and the new type of terrorists that this country is dealing with. Regarding Iran, Iran is the central issue in the Middle East and their capacity to become a nuclear power. They are one of the 4 state sponsors of terror in the world. I sit on the House Select Committee on Intelligence. I can't reveal classified information, but I can say this. As President of the United States, I will do everything to make sure that Iran does not become a nuclear power.
30 seconds, Congressman Paul.
Well, I think she turns our rule of law on its head. She says that the terrorists don't deserve protection under our courts, but therefore a judgment has to be made. They're ruled a terrorist. Who rules them a terrorist? I thought our courts recognized that you had to be tried, and we've done this. And we've brought individuals back from Pakistan and other places. We've given them a trial in this country. Over 300, or at least near 300, we tried and put them in prison. So this idea that we have to turn on its head and reject the rule of law, we already are at the point where this administration, please let me finish. I have to say, this administration already has accepted the principle that when you assume somebody is a terrorist, they can be targeted for assassination, even American citizens. That affects all of us eventually. You don't want to translate our rule of law into a rule of mob rule. You've heard the war propaganda that is liable to lead us into the sixth war, and I worry about that position. Iran is a threat because they have some militants there. But believe me, they're all around the world, and they're all around the world, and they're not a whole lot different than others. Iran does not have an air force that can come here. They can't even make enough gasoline for themselves. And here we are, building this case out, please. They're building up this case just like we did in Iraq. Build up the war propaganda. There was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and they had nuclear weapons, and we had to go in. I'm sure you supported that war as well. Okay. It's time we quit this. It's time. It's trillions of dollars we're spending on these wars. Why do we have to have a license to get married? Why don't we just go to the church? And what other individuals do, why can't we permit them to do it? Whatever they call it. That's their problem, not mine. Just so nobody else forces their definition of marriage on you. That is what we have to prevent. So I would say less government would be better. If you have to have regulations, let the state governments do it. But that is one thing that we could do. But eventually we have to deal with the Fed, because the Fed creates the business cycle. If you don't understand the business cycle, you don't know why we have recessions. The sooner we learn that, the better.
Thank you. Senator Santorum.
Congressman Paul.
I've been in politics for 35 years. My cause has been the cause of liberty. And I am convinced that liberty does not come from our government, but it comes from our Creator. And our goal should be peace and prosperity. It is under the principles of liberty that you have the greatest chance of achieving peace and prosperity. That is why I am so down on these wars that it's costing us trillions of dollars, why we have to reform the monetary system, why we need honest money, a gold standard and not paper money out of the Federal Reserve System. But also we need to change the environment for our businesses. We need to lower the regulations and the taxes and have private property rights and contract rights. Then we can achieve peace and real prosperity. Well, I think in theory, if you understood the free market and a free society, you don't need government to do that. And we live in a society where we have been adapted to this, and you can't just drop it all at once, but you can transition away from it. On regulations, no, I don't believe in any of these federal regulations, but that doesn't mean I don't believe in regulations. The regulation of the marketplace takes care of it. Just think if we had the regulations on the market that dealt with the bankruptcies, that had to go bankrupt. We wouldn't have been able to bail out the big banks and the big corporations and dump on the poor people. Well, so the market would dictate it. You can't commit fraud. If you need detailed regulations, you can do it at the state level, but the federal government is not authorized to nitpick every little transaction. The way they use the interstate commerce clause is outrageous as far as I'm concerned.
Well, 30 seconds more for devil's advocate here, because would you then put it on the drug companies to say, no, we're bringing this to market, trust us, it's a fantastic drug. All the pilots in the sky to add to their responsibilities their own air traffic control in an organic way.
What I said is theoretically it could be privatized, but who ends up doing the regulations on the drugs? They do as much harm as good. They don't take good care of us. Who gets to write the regulations? The bureaucrats write the regulations, but who writes the laws? The lobbyists have control. So the lobbyists from the drug industry has control
control of writing the regulations, so you turn it over to the bureaucracy, but you would have private institutions that could become credible. And I mean, do we need the federal government to tell us whether we buy a safe car? I say the consumers of America are smart enough to decide what kind of car they can buy and whether it's safe or not, and they don't need federal government hounding them and putting so much regulations on that our car industry has gone overseas.
Do you advocate getting rid of the minimum wage? Would that create more jobs?
Absolutely, and it would help the poor, the people who need a job. The minimum wage is a mandate. We're against mandates, so why should we have it? No, it would be very beneficial. Mandates, that's what the whole society is about. That's what we do all the time. That's what government does. Mandate, mandate, mandate. And what we talk so much about the Obama mandate, which is very important, but what about Medicare? Isn't that a mandate? Everything we do is a mandate. So this is why you have to look at this at the cause of liberty. We don't need the government running our lives. Well, the airlines are responsible for carrying their cargo and their passengers. I mean, why should we assume that a bureaucracy can do better? And look at the monstrosity we have at the airports. These TSA agents are abusive. Sometimes they're accused of all kinds of sexual activities on the way they maul people at the airports. So the airlines could do that.
Your best at LAX tonight.
I would think the airlines should treat passengers as well as a company that hauls money around. And they protect their money. They have private guards, and they could do it. Just remember, 9/11 came about because there was too much government. Government was more or less in charge. They told the pilots they couldn't have guns, and they were told never to resist. They set up the stage for all this. So no, private markets do a good job in protecting, much better than this bureaucracy called the TSA, let me tell you.
Let me ask you about something else. It's related in a way, has to do with Mother Nature. Before the broadcast, Senator Santorum's got flooding today in Pennsylvania. Governor Perry is just back from the wildfires out east. Category 1 storm laid waste to entire areas. There's standing water tonight, Paterson, New Jersey. Many of the towns around where I live, 8 days without power. We had people eating in outdoor and public parks because the supermarkets were closed down. The question is, federal aid, something like FEMA. If you object to what it's become and how's it's run, your position is to remove it, take it away, abolish it. What happens in its absence?
Well, what happened before 1979? We didn't have FEMA, and that FEMA just conditioned people to build where they shouldn't be building. We lose the market effect of that. But yeah, my position is we should have never had it. There's a much better way of doing it. I mean, this whole idea that the federal government can deal with weather and anything in the world, just go to the federal government. FEMA's broke. They're $20 billion in debt. But I'm not for saying tomorrow, close it down. A lot of people pay the insurance. I worked real hard to make it work, and I did that in my district too. But I'll tell you how we should do it. We're spending, believe it or not, this blew my mind when I read this, $20 billion a year for air conditioning in Afghanistan and Iraq, in the tents over there, and all the air conditioning. Cut that $20 billion out, bring it home, take 10 off the debt, and put 10 into FEMA or whoever else needs it, child health care or whatever. But I'll tell you what, if we did that and took the air conditioning out of the green zone, our troops would come home, and that would make me happy. But the people who want big fences and guns, sure, we could secure the borders. A barbed wire fence with machine guns, that would do the trick. I don't believe that's what America is all about. I just really don't. We can enforce our law. If we had a healthy economy, this wouldn't be such a bad deal. People are worrying about jobs. But every time you think about this toughness on the border and ID cards and real IDs, think that it's a penalty against the American people too. I think this fence business is designed and may well be used against us and keep us in. In economic turmoil, the people want to leave with their capital, and there's capital controls and there's people control. So every time you think of a fence keeping all those bad people out, think about those fences maybe being used against us, keeping us in. If there are poor people in Texas, we have a responsibility. I'd like to see it voluntary as possible, but under our Constitution, our states have that right. If they feel the obligation, they have a perfect right to. So don't always try to turn around and say that we who believe in liberty, we lack compassion.
because we who believe in liberty and understand the market, we're the only ones that really understand how people are taken care of, how they are fed, and how people have jobs. It's the market. It's never the government that does it. So this whole idea that there's something wrong with people who don't lavish out free stuff from the federal government somehow aren't compassionate enough. I resist those accusations.
Because government is too big in Washington, D.C., it's run away. We have no controls of spending, taxes, regulations, no control in the Federal Reserve printing money. So if we want government, whether it's medical care or whatever, it's proper to do it at the local level as well as our schools. But there's no authority in the Constitution to do so much of what we're doing. There's no authority for them to run our schools, no authority to control our economy, and no authority to control us as individuals on what we do with our personal lives. Care about your children, you'll get the federal government out of the business of educating our kids. In 1980, when the Republican Party ran, part of the platform was to get rid of the Department of Education. By the year 2000, it was eliminated, and we fed on to it. Then we, as Republicans, added No Child Left Behind. So the first thing a president should do is that the goal should be set to get the government out completely, but don't enforce this law of No Child Left Behind. It's not going to do any good, and nobody likes it. And there's no value to it. The teachers don't like it, and the students don't like it. But there are other things that the federal government can do, and that is give tax credits for the people who will opt out. We ought to have a right to opt out of the public system if you want. I don't know how you're going to police it. So I don't think you should create. We have too many laws already. Now, how are you going to police the day after pill? It doesn't make any sense to me in a practical matter. So I would say that nobody can outdo me on respect for life. I've spent a lifetime dealing with life, but I still think there is a time where the law doesn't solve the problems. Only the moral character of the people will eventually solve this problem, not the law. Government destroys jobs, the market creates jobs. So the government isn't going to be expected to create the jobs. They have to change the environment. But you can't do that unless you understand where the depression, recessions come from. And you can't understand that unless you know where the bubbles come from. I've been arguing this case for 20 years and warning about bubbles and housing bubbles and NASDAQ bubbles, and a lot of other economists have been doing the same thing. Until we understand that, you can't solve the problem. You have to deal with the Federal Reserve System. You have to deal with free markets, and you have to deal with the tax program and the regulatory system. Then you can get your jobs, because the people will create the jobs, not the government.
Congressman Paul, a number and a time frame and an idea.
My approach is slightly different, where I think all for less taxes and less regulations. We recognize this. But I emphasize the fact that you have to know why we have a recession and why we have unemployment before you can solve the problem. And the financial bubbles are created by excessive credit and stimulation by the Federal Reserve. And then you have bubbles, and you have to have a correction. This stimulus creates excessive debt and malinvestment. As long as you don't correct that and you maintain the debt and the malinvestment, you can't get back to economic growth again. Unfortunately, so far, what we have done is we have not liquidated the debt. We have dumped the debt on the American people through TARP funding and as well as the Federal Reserve. So the debt is dumped on the people. And what did we do? We bailed out the people that were benefiting during the formation of the bubble. So as long as we do that, we're not going to have economic growth. We did the same thing in the Depression. The Japanese are doing it right now. So it's time we liquidate the debt and look at monetary policy, and then, of course, lower taxes. And I would like to do, in the first year, cut $1 trillion, because that is the culprit, big spending and big government. I want to extend the tax cut, because if you don't, you raise the taxes. But I want to pay for it. And it's not that difficult. In my proposal, my budget, I want to cut hundreds of billions of dollars from overseas. The trust fund is gone, but how are we going to restore it? We have to quit the spending. We have to quit this being the policeman of the world. We don't need another war in Syria, another war in Iran. just get rid of the embassy in Baghdad. We're pretending we're coming home from Baghdad. We built an embassy there that cost $1 billion, and we're putting 17,000 contractors in there and pretending our troops are coming home. I could save the money, and we don't have to raise taxes on Social Security, on the tax.
I want to bring Congress.
And the other thing that really should have annoyed a lot of people, he received a lot of money from Freddie Mac. Now, Freddie Mac is essentially a government organization. While he was earning a lot of money from Freddie Mac, I was fighting over a decade to try to explain to people where the housing bubble was coming from. So Freddie Mac gets bailed out by the taxpayers. So in a way, Newt, I think you probably got some of our taxpayers' money. They got money out, and they're still getting bailed out. But you're a spokesman for them, and you receive money for them. So I think this is something that the people ought to know about. But there's been many positions, and you have admitted many of the positions where you have changed positions. But if you were looking for a consistent position, I think there's be a little bit of trouble anybody competing with me on consistency. Over a long period of time.
Well, first of all, as you say normally in your own speeches, the housing bubble came from the Federal Reserve inflating the money supply. Now, that's the core of the housing bubble. And I happen to be with you on auditing the Fed and frankly, on firing Bernanke. Second, I was never a spokesman for any agency. I never did any lobbying for any agency. I offered strategic advice. I was in the private sector. And I was doing things in the private sector.
Not the private sector.
And when you're in the private sector and you have a company and you offer advice, like McKinsey does, like a bunch of other companies do, you're allowed to charge money for it.
What about it?
It's called free enterprise.
It's the taxpayers' money, though. We had to bail these people out. I think character is obviously very important. I don't think it should be necessary to have to talk about it. I think it should show through in the way we live. And I think it should show through in your marriage. And I happen to have been married for 54 years and a family person. But I don't think we should have to talk about it. But you know what? Probably is every bit as important. If your marriage vows are important, what about our oath of office? That's what really gets to me. That's where you're really on the line as a public figure. And that's where I think a lot of people come up real short, because there's many times that I've been forced to Congress because I take my oath very seriously. I end up sometimes, believe it or not, voting all by myself, thinking that why aren't they people paying attention? Why don't they read Article 1, Section 8? If we took that oath of office seriously in Washington, we'd get rid of 80% of the government. The budget would be balanced. We'd have sound money, and we would have prosperity, and we wouldn't be the policemen of the world. We wouldn't have a Federal Reserve System, and we wouldn't be invading the privacy of every single individual in this country with bills like the Patriot Act. We'd have a free society and a prosperous society. No, I don't agree with that, and that's just stirring up trouble. And I believe in a non-interventionist foreign policy. I don't think we should get in the middle of these squabbles, but to go out of our way to say that so-and-so is not a real people. Technically and historically, yes, under the Ottoman Empire, the Palestinians didn't have a state, but neither did Israel have a state then, too. But this is how we get involved in so many messes, and I think it just fails on the side of practicing a little bit of diplomacy, getting ourselves into trouble, mentioning things that are unnecessary. The people in those regions should be dealing with these problems. We shouldn't be dealing with these things, but historically, under the Ottoman Empire, that is technically correct. But to make these decisions and deciding what the settlement is going to be should be the people that are involved. This idea that we can be the policemen of the world and settle all these disputes, I mean, soon we'll have to quit because we're flat-out broke, but we cannot continue to get into these issues like this and getting ourselves into more trouble. Well, I feel very fortunate because although I was raised in a family that was rather poor, but I didn't even know it. It was during the Depression and World War II, and we didn't have very much, and I worked my way through college, and that was a natural instinct because that's what you were supposed to do. But I finally did a little bit better in medical school because I had my wife work our way through medical school. So that worked out a little bit better. But middle class is suffering. But not only because we bail out the rich and dump on the poor and they lose their jobs and they lose their houses, but there's a characteristic about monetary policy. When a country destroys its currency, it transfers wealth from the middle class to the wealthy. And this is what you're seeing today, the elimination of the middle class. And it's going to get a lot worse unless we address the subject overspending, overborrowing, and printing too much money, and understanding the business cycle. If people are doing things that hurt other people, yes. But if you embark on instituting a society where government protects you from yourself, you're in big trouble. And that's what they're doing. I think what we've had here is a demonstration of why should we have a candidate that's going to have to explain themselves. 70% of the people want further explanations on what your positions are. So I think that is endless. But you talk about the Obamacare using force. But that's all government is force. I mean, do you have a choice about paying Medicare taxes? So there's not a whole lot of difference. You're forced to buy insurance. That's one step further. But you have to stop with force. Once government uses force to mold behavior or mold the economy, they've overstepped the bounds and they violated the whole concept of our revolution and our Constitution.
And if you stick in the minute, we will not run over the commercial. Tell us the one thing you've learned from someone else, one of your challengers on stage. Governor Perry.
I tell you, Congressman Paul got me really intrigued with the whole the Federal Reserve, and I've spent a substantial amount of time reading about and Currency Wars, the book by James Rickards. But Congressman Paul is the individual on the stage that got me most interested in a subject that I found to be quite interesting and at the root of a lot of the problems that we have, and I thank you for that. But the one thing that I found outside of these fine individuals on this stage is that the people of this country really want to get America back on track.
I always find the principle of leadership to be most interesting. And as I look at the people on the stage, each exhibits different qualities of leadership, and they've each exercised. One of the things about Ron Paul that always amazes me is when I come to a debate like this, the only signs I see are the Ron Paul people out there in freezing.
I'm Congressman Ron Paul from Texas. I'm the champion of liberty. I am the only one that has offered a balanced budget in a sincere method. And also, I present the case for a free society as being the best defense for peace and prosperity.
And freezing temperatures are always there. He ignites an enthusiasm with a number of people that's very exciting to watch.
I have learned that you should never give up on your opposition, because if you're persistent and you present your case, they will come your way. So, Rick, I appreciate it. I appreciate it. You're open to the Federal Reserve. That is wonderful. But I work on the assumption that freedom brings people together. And if you understand freedom, it's based on tolerance and nonviolence. So if it's tolerance, it should be bringing all kinds of people together, and that's following our Constitution. We shouldn't be fighting among ourselves, because we shouldn't be fighting in Washington. If we all take the same oath of office, where does the fight come from? Somebody is messing up somewhere. So I would say that with persistence, I think that we can all prevail and come up with the right answers. Oh, it is, because it raises revenues, and the worst part about it is it's regressive. A lot of people aren't paying any taxes, and I like that. I don't think that we should even things up by raising taxes. So it is a regressive tax, so it's very, very dangerous in that thing, and it will raise more revenues. But the gentleman asked the question, he didn't even ask what we're talking about. He asked the question, what are you going to replace the income tax with? And I say nothing. That's what we should replace it with. But I do want to make a point that spending is a tax. As soon as the government spends money, eventually it's a tax. Sometimes we put a direct tax on the people, sometimes we borrow the money, and sometimes we print the money. And then when prices go up, like today, the wholesale price index went up 7% rate.
And if you look at the free market, the prices are going up 9 and 10%. So that is the tax. So spending is the tax. That is the reason I offered the program to cut $1 trillion out of the first year budget that I offered. There's a pretty good support up here for getting rid of Obamacare because it's a Democratic proposal. And we want to opt out. I think we'd all agree on this. But if you want better competition and better health care, you should allow the American people to opt out of government medicine. And we need more competition in medicine. But the most important thing is letting the people have control of their money and get it out of the hands of the third party. As soon as you go to the government, the lobbyists line up, the drug companies line up, the insurance companies line up, and even with Obamacare, the industries, the corporations get behind it and affect the outcome, and already insurance premiums are going up. But when we approach this immigration problem, we should look at the incentives, and that are the mandates from the federal government saying that you must educate and must give them free education. You have to remove these incentives, but I don't think the answer is a fence whatsoever. But in order to attract Latino votes, I think, too long, this country has always put people in groups. They penalize people because they're in groups, and then they reward people because they're in groups. But following up on what Newt was saying, we need a healthy economy. We wouldn't be talking about this. We need to see everybody as an individual. And to me, seeing everybody as an individual means their liberties are protected as individuals, and they're treated that way, and they're never penalized that way. So if you have a free and prosperous society, all of a sudden this group mentality melts away. As long as there's no abuse, one place where there's still a lot of discrimination in this country is in our court systems, and I think the minorities come up with a shorthand in our court system. I would like to explain that rights don't come in bunches. Rights come as individuals, they come from a God, and they come as each individual has a right to life and liberty. But I might add about the border control and the Latino vote is we lack resources there. I think we should have more border guards on and a more orderly transition and run it much better. But where are our resources? We worry more about the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. We need to bring the guard units home and the units back here so we can have more personnel on our border.
Do you support opening the National Nuclear Repository at Yucca Mountain?
I've opposed this. We've had votes in the Congress. There was a time when I voted with two other individuals, the two congressmen from Nevada. And I approach it from a states' rights position. What right does 49 states have to punish one state and say, we're going to put our garbage in your state? I think that's wrong. But I think it's very serious. But quite frankly, the government shouldn't be in the business of subsidizing any form of energy, and nuclear energy, I think, is a good source of energy, but they still get subsidies. Then they assume this responsibility. Then we as politicians and the bureaucrats get involved in this, and then we get involved with which state's going to get stuck with the garbage. So I would say the more the free market handles this, and the more you deal with property rights and no subsidies to any form of energy, the easier this problem would be solved. We can't blame the victims, but we also have to point. I'd go to Washington as well as Wall Street, but I'd go over to the Federal Reserve. They create the financial bubbles, and you have to understand that. You can't solve these problems if you don't know where these bubbles come from. But then when the bailout came, and supported by both parties, you have to realize, 2008, Republicans were still in charge, so the bailouts came from both parties. Guess who they bailed out? The big corporations, the people who were ripping off the people in the derivatives market, and they said, the world's going to come to an end unless we bail out all the banks. So the banks were involved, and the Federal Reserve was involved, but who got stuck? The middle class got stuck. They got stuck. They lost their jobs, and they lost their houses. If you had to give money out, you should have given it to the people who were losing their mortgages, not to the banks. Yes, the argument is the program was okay, but it was mismanaged. But I work on the assumption that government's not very capable of managing almost anything, so you shouldn't put that much trust into government. You have to trust the marketplace, and when the government gets involved, they have to deal with fraud. And how many people have gone to jail, either in the government, Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, that participated in this, and nobody suffers the consequences? All these investigations, and yet the people who lose their jobs and lose their houses It's their fault, that's why they're on Wall Street, and we can't blame them. We have to blame the business cycle and the economic policies that led to this disaster.
Congressman Paul, you've just proposed eliminating the Departments of Commerce, Education, Energy, Interior, Housing, and Urban Development. You say it'll save $1 trillion in 1 year.
We have an empire. We can't afford it. The empires always bring great nations down. We spread ourselves too thinly around the world. This is what's happened throughout history, and we're doing it to ourselves. The most recent empire to fail was an empire that went into, of all places, Afghanistan. They went broke. So where are we in Afghanistan? I say it's time to come home. I think we're on economic suicide if we're not even willing to look at some of these overseas expenditures, 150 bases, 900 bases, 150 different countries. We have enough weapons to blow up the world about 20, 25 times. We have more weapons than all the other countries put together, essentially. And we want to spend more and more, and you can't cut a penny? I mean, this is why we're at an impasse. I want to hear somebody up here willing to cut something real. This budget is in bad shape, and the financial calamity is going to be much worse than anybody ever invading this country. Which country? Are they going to invade this country? They can't even shoot a missile on foreign aid. That should be the easiest thing to cut. It's not authorized in the Constitution that we can take money from you and give it to particular countries around the world. To me, foreign aid is taking money from poor people in this country and giving it to rich people in poor countries, and it becomes weapons of war, essentially. No matter how well motivated it is.
Congressman Paul, would you cut aid to Israel?
I would cut all foreign aid. I would treat everybody equally and fairly. No, you have to let it liquidate. We took 40 years to build up this worldwide debt. We're in a debt crisis never seen before in our history. The sovereign debt of this world is equal to the GDP, as ours is in this country. If you prop it up, you'll do exactly what we did in the Depression, prolong the agony. If you prop it up, you do what Japan has done for 20 years. So yes, you want to liquidate the debt. The debt is unsustainable, and this bubble was predictable because 40 years ago we had no restraints whatsoever on the monetary authorities, and we piled debt on debt. We pyramided debt. We had no restraints on the spending, and if you keep bailing people out and prop it up, you just prolong the agony, as we're doing in the housing bubble. Right now, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are demanding more money because we don't allow the market to determine what these mortgages are worth. If you don't liquidate this and clear the market, believe me, you're going to perpetuate this for a decade or two more, and that is very, very dangerous. Now, the other thing is that you must do, if you want to get the economy going again, is you have to get rid of price fixing. And the most significant price fixing that goes on that gave us the bubble, destroyed the economy, and is preventing this from coming out is the price fixing of the Federal Reserve, manipulating interest rates way below market rates. You have to have the market determine interest rates if you want a healthy, viable economy. So what you want is the market to determine this. Whoever thought that one person, the Federal Reserve Board chairman, knows what the money supply should be? Just in the past 6 months, M1 has gone up at the rate of 30%. That spells inflation, that spells lower standard of living and higher prices, and watch out, they're coming.
So, Congressman Paul, you've already talked about the fact that you want to get rid of the Department of Education. You've said that you want to get rid of federal student loans. So how would you make college more accessible, more affordable for these students and students around the country?
Well, I think you proved that the policy of student loans is a total failure. I mean, $1 trillion of debt, and it's going to be dumped on the taxpayer. And what have they gotten? A poorer education, and costs that have skyrocketed because of inflation, and they don't have jobs. There's nothing more dramatically failing than that program. So, no, there's no authority in the Constitution for the federal government to be dealing with education. We should get rid of the loan programs. We should get rid of the Department of Education and give tax credits if you have to help people. But the inflation is the big problem. 3 times the rate that the government admits inflation is, and that is natural and normal. When governments inflate the currency, it goes in the areas that the government gets involved in. Housing, high prices go up. Stock market, skyrocketing prices. Medical care, skyrocketing. Education.
How do they pay for it? How do they now pay for college if they're not?
The way you pay for cell phones and computers. You have the marketplace there.
There's competition. Quality goes up, the price goes down. Can you imagine what it would have been like if the Department of Homeland Security was in charge of finding one person or one company to make the cell phones? I mean, it would have been a total disaster. So when the government gets involved in the delivery of any service, whether it's education, medical care, or housing, they cause higher prices, lower quality, create bubbles, and they give us this mess that we're in. That's why we have to eventually we have to wise up and look at where the bubbles come from. It's from the Federal Reserve, and we should start by auditing the Fed, and then we should end the Fed. But there is a lot of crony capitalism going on in this country, and that has to be distinguished from real capitalism, because that's this occupation stuff on Wall Street. If you're going after crony capitalism, I'm all for it. And those are the people who benefit from contracts from government, benefits from the Federal Reserve, benefits from all the bailouts. They don't deserve compassion. But crony capitalism isn't when somebody makes money and they produce a product. That is very important. We have to distinguish the two. And unfortunately, I think some people mix that. But this, to me, is so vital that we recognize what capitalism is versus crony capitalism. And believe me, when you have an inflationary environment and all this speculation and all the bailouts due to the monetary system, believe me, you get a majority of crony capitalism, and that's why we're facing this crisis today.
You'd have to go to the Congress. We as Commander-in-Chief, aren't making the decision to go to war. You know, the old-fashioned way, the Constitution, you go to the Congress and find out if our national security is threatened. And I'm afraid what's going on right now, it's similar to the war propaganda that went on against Iraq. And, you know, they didn't have weapons of mass destruction, and it was orchestrated, and it was, to me, a tragedy of what's happened these last 10 years, the death and destruction, $4 trillion in debt. So, no, it's not worthwhile going to war. If you do, you get a declaration of war, and you fight it, and you win it, and get it over with.
Thank you, Congressman.
Torture is illegal. And by our laws, it's illegal by international laws.
How do you define torture, sir?
Well, waterboarding is torture, and many other things. It's illegal under international law and under our law. It's also immoral, and it's also very impractical. There's no evidence that you really get reliable evidence. Why would you accept the position of torturing 100 people because you know one person might have information? And that's what you do when you accept the principle of torture. I think it's uncivilized and have no practical advantages, and it's really un-American to accept on principle that we will torture people that we capture. But for us to get in the middle of that and prop up the different dictatorships, this is why we get into this trouble. It's overthrowing dictatorships that we have supported that causes so much of this problem. So to get further involved, you want to have self-determination. We don't need to lose any more troops. You get in there with covert operations, then you have troops involved.
Thank you, Congressman.
And it's very costly against a tactic, and therefore there's no limits to it. So we create these monstrosities, and we do things outside the law. We come up with assassinations, allowing the president to decide who's going to be assassinated. And lo and behold, 3 Americans now have been on the list. They've been assassinated, but they don't talk about the second one, because the second one happened to be a 16-year-old son of a Lockheed. So what are we doing here to accept this idea that our president is in this lawlessness to pursue, and that we someday will be subject to those same courts? So no, you don't. You want to live within the law and obey the law, because otherwise it's going to be very bad for all of us. And this whole idea that now we can be assassinated by somebody that we don't even like to run our medical care, and giving this power to the president to be the prosecutor, the executor, the judge, and the jury, we better look at that carefully before you automatically endorse something like that.
Congressman, please.
I voted for the authority to go after bin Laden. I was upset because it took 10 years, because we were diverted from going after him and doing the job. But that's a lot different than assassinating American citizens. I mean, he wasn't a citizen. But I do want to remind you that over 300 individuals were tried in civilian courts here that were charged with terrorism here. Most of them are in jail, and I don't think we should give up so easily on our rule of law. But I am convinced that needless and unnecessary
unnecessary wars are a great detriment. They undermine our prosperity and our liberties. They add to our deficits, and they consume our welfare. We should take a careful look at our foreign policy. I think the Patriot Act is unpatriotic because it undermines our liberty. I'm concerned, as everybody is, about the terrorist attack. Timothy McVeigh was a vicious terrorist. He was arrested. Terrorism, still on the books, internationally and nationally, is a criminal. It's a crime, and we should deal with it. We dealt with it rather well with Timothy McVeigh. But why I really fear it is we have drifted into a condition that we were warned against, because our early founders were very clear. They said, don't be willing to sacrifice liberty for security. Today, it seems too easy that our government and our Congresses are so willing to give up our liberties for our security. I have a personal belief that you never have to give up liberty for security. You can still provide security without sacrificing our Bill of Rights. This is like saying that we need a policeman in every house, a camera in every house, because we want to prevent child beating and wife beating. You can prevent crimes by becoming a police state. So if you advocate the police state, yes, you can have safety and security, and you might prevent a crime, but the crime then will be against the American people and against our freedoms, and we will throw out so much of what our revolution was fought for. So don't do it so carelessly. That's digging a hole for ourselves. What if they look like Timothy McVeigh? You know, he was pretty tough criminal. I think we're using too much carelessness in the use of words that we're at war. I don't remember voting on a declaration of war. Oh, war against terrorism. And terrorism is a tactic. It isn't a person. It isn't a people. So this is a very careless use of words. What about this? Sacrifice liberties because they're terrorists? You're the judge and the jury? No, they're suspects. And they have changed in the DOD budget, they have changed the wording on the definition of Al-Qaeda and Taliban. It's anybody associated with organizations, which means almost anybody can be loosely associated. So that makes all Americans vulnerable. And now we know that American citizens are vulnerable to assassination. So I would be very cautious about protecting the rule of law. It will be a sacrifice that you'll be sorry for. No, I wouldn't do that. But there'd be good reasons, because I don't expect it to happen, because, you know, the Mossad leader that just retired said it would be the stupidest thing to do in the world. And it's a big argument over in Israel. They're not about to do this. They've just polled 40 major experts on foreign policy here by the National Journal. Not one of them said there should be a unilateral attack on the sites in Iran. So that's not going to happen. And if it did, you're supposing that if it did, why does Israel need our help? We need to get out of their way. I mean, we interfere with them. We interfere with them when they deal with their borders, when they want to have peace treaties. We tell them what they can do because we buy their allegiance and they sacrifice their sovereignty to us. And then they decide they want to bomb something. That's their business, but they should, you know, suffer the consequences. When they bombed the Iraqi missile site, nuclear site back in the 80s, I was one of the few in Congress that said it's none of our business, and Israel should take care of themselves. Israel has 200, 300 nuclear missiles, and they can take care of themselves. Why should we commit? We don't even have a treaty with Israel. Why do we have this automatic commitment that we're going to send our kids and send our money endlessly to Israel? So I think they're quite capable of taking care of themselves. I think we do detriment. Just think of all the money we gave to Egypt over 30 or 40 years. Now look, we were buying friendship. Now there's a civil war. They're less friendly to Israel. That whole thing is going to backfire once we go bankrupt and we remove our troops. So I think we should be very cautious in our willingness to go to war and send troops without a proper declaration by the U.S. Congress.
Let me let her on, Paul.
I think the aid is all worthless. It doesn't do any good for most of the people. You take money from poor people in this country and you end up giving it to rich people in poor countries. And they're used as weapons of war, so you accomplish nothing. We should export maybe some principles about free markets and sound money, and maybe they could produce some of their own wealth. But this whole idea of talking about the endless wars and the endless foreign aid, it seems like Nobody cares about the budget. I mean, we're in big trouble, and nobody wants to cut anything. So if you're going to keep sending foreign aid overseas and these endless wars that you don't have to declare and go into Libya without even consulting with the Congress, the biggest threat to our national security is our financial condition, and this is just aggravating it.
That point.
Well, they're not cutting anything out of anything. All this talk is just talk. Believe me. They're nibbling away at baseline budgeting. It's automatic increases. There's nothing cut against the military, and the people on the Hill are nearly hysterical because the budget isn't going up as rapidly as they wanted to. It's a road to disaster. We better wake up. Not entirely. No, the drug war was mentioned. I think that's another war we ought to cancel because it is to nobody's benefit. And that's where the violence is coming from. But yes, we do have a national responsibility for our borders. What I'm sort of tired of is all the money spent and lives lost worrying about the borders between Pakistan and Afghanistan, forgetting about our borders between the United States and Mexico. We should think more about, what we're doing at home. We need better immigration services, obviously. But, if you subsidize something or give people incentives, you get more of it. So if you give easy road to citizenship, you're going to have more illegals. If you have a weak economy, which is understandable and we should have prevented, that's understandable. But mandating to the states and to Texas that we have to provide free medical care and free education, that's a great burden. It was a great burden to California and all the border states. So I would say eliminate all these benefits and talk about eliminating the welfare state because it's detrimental not only to here but the people that come, because that's the incentive to bring their families with them. But we're going to put people who are sick and dying with cancer and they're being helped with marijuana if they have multiple sclerosis. The federal government's going in there and overriding state laws and putting people like that in prison. Why don't we handle the drugs like we had alcohol? Alcohol's a deadly drug. What about the real deadly drugs are the prescription drugs? They kill a lot more people than the illegal drugs. So the drug war is out of control. I fear the drug war because it undermines our civil liberties. It magnifies our problems on the borders. We spend, over the last 40 years, $1 trillion on this war. And believe me, the kids can still get the drugs. It just hasn't worked. But what is our business? Why should we spend more money and more lives to get involved in another war? That is the internal affairs of the other nations, and we don't need another nation to start nation building. We have way too many already. So this is just looking for more trouble. I would say, why don't we mind our own business? I worry most about overreaction on our part, getting involved in another war when we don't need to, when we haven't been attacked, and our national security has not been at threat. And I worry a lot about people never come around to understanding who the Taliban is and why they are motivated. Taliban doesn't mean they want to come here and kill us. The Taliban means they want to kill us over there because all they want to do is get people who occupy their country out of their country, just like we would if anybody tried to occupy us. We bailed out the people that were benefiting during the formation of the bubble. So as long as we do that, we're not going to have economic growth. We did the same thing in the Depression. The Japanese are doing it right now. So it's time we liquidate the debt and look at monetary policy and then, of course, lower taxes. And I would like to do in the first year, cut $1 trillion because that is the culprit, big spending and big government. Well, I want to extend the tax cut because if you don't, you raise the taxes, but I want to pay for it. And it's not that difficult. In my proposal, my budget, I want to cut hundreds of billions of dollars from overseas. The trust fund is gone, but how are we going to restore it? We have to quit the spending. We have to quit this being the policeman of the world. We don't need another war in Syria, another war in Iran. Just get rid of the embassy in Baghdad. We're pretending we're coming home from Baghdad. We built an embassy there that cost $1 billion, and we're putting 17,000 contractors in there and pretending our troops are coming home. I could save the money, and we don't have to raise taxes. And the other thing that really should have annoyed a lot of people, he received a lot of money from Freddie Mac. Now, Freddie Mac is essentially a government organization. While he was earning a lot of money from Freddie Mac, I was fighting over a decade to try to explain to people where the housing bubble was coming from. So Freddie Mac gets bailed out
by the taxpayers. So in a way, Newt, I think you probably got some of our taxpayers' money. They got taxes, they got money out, and they're still getting bailed out. But you're a spokesman for them, and you receive money for them. So I think this is something that the people ought to know about. But there's been many positions, and you have admitted many of the positions where you have changed positions. But if you were looking for a consistent position, I think there's be a little bit of trouble anybody competing with me on consistency over a long period of time.
I offered strategic advice. I was in the private sector, and I was doing things in the private sector.
Okay.
It's called free enterprise.
It's the taxpayers' money, though. We had to bail these people out. But you know what probably is every bit as important, if your marriage vows are important, what about our oath of office? That's what really gets to me. That's where you're really on the line as a public figure. And that's where I think a lot of people come up real short, because there's many times that I've been forced to Congress because I take my oath very seriously. I end up sometimes, believe it or not, voting all by myself, thinking that why aren't they people paying attention? Why don't they read Article 1, Section 8? If we took that oath of office seriously in Washington, we'd get rid of 80% of the government. The budget would be balanced. We'd have sound money, and we would have prosperity, and we wouldn't be the policemen of the world. We wouldn't have a Federal Reserve System, and we wouldn't be invading the privacy of every single individual in this country with bills like the Patriot Act. We'd have a free society and a prosperous society. And so many messes, and I think it just fails on the side of practicing a little bit of diplomacy, getting ourselves into trouble. But to make these decisions and deciding what the settlement is going to be should be the people that are involved. This idea that we can be the policemen of the world and settle all these disputes, I mean, soon we'll have to quit because we're flat out broke, but we cannot continue to get into these issues like this and getting ourselves into more trouble. But middle class is suffering, but not only because we bail out the rich and dump on the poor and they lose their jobs and they lose their houses, but there's a characteristic about monetary policy. When a country destroys its currency, it transfers wealth from the middle class to the wealthy. And this is what you're seeing today, the elimination of the middle class, and it's going to get a lot worse unless we address the subject overspending, overborrowing, and printing too much money, and understanding the business cycle. People are doing things that hurt other people, yes, but if you embark on instituting a society where government protects you from yourself, you're in big trouble, and that's what they're doing. But you talk about the Obamacare using force. But that's all government is force. I mean, do you have a choice about paying Medicare taxes? So there's not a whole lot of difference. You're forced to buy insurance. That's one step further. But you have to stop with force. Once government uses force to mold behavior or mold the economy, they've overstepped the bounds and they violated the whole concept of our revolution and our Constitution.
Tell us the one thing you've learned from someone else, one of your challengers on stage. Governor Perry.
I tell you, Congressman Paul got me really intrigued with the whole the Federal Reserve, and I've spent a substantial amount of time reading about and Currency Wars, the book by James Ricard's. But Congressman Paul is the individual on the stage that got me most interested in a subject that I've found to be quite interesting and at the root of a lot of the problems that we have, and I thank you for that.
I always find the principle of leadership to be most interesting. And as I look at the people on the stage, each exhibits different qualities of leadership, and they've each exercised leadership in different ways. One of the things about Ron Paul that always amazes me is when I come to a debate like this, the only signs I see are the Ron Paul people out there in freezing temperatures are always there. He ignites an enthusiasm with a number of people that's very exciting to watch.
I have learned that you should never give up on your opposition, because if you're persistent and you present your case, they will come your way. So, Rick, I appreciate it. Michelle, I appreciate it. You're open to the Federal Reserve. That is wonderful. But I I work on the assumption that freedom brings people together. And if you understand freedom, it's based on tolerance and nonviolence. So if it's tolerance, it should be bringing all kinds of people together, and that's following our Constitution. We shouldn't be fighting among ourselves, because we shouldn't be fighting in Washington. If we all take the same oath of office, where does the fight come from? Somebody is messing up somewhere. So I would say that with persistence, I think that we can all prevail and come up with the right answers.
Congressman Ron Paul.
But there are many Republicans inside and outside of this state who openly doubt whether you can be elected president. How can you convince them otherwise? And if you don't wind up winning this nomination, will you pledge here tonight that you will support the ultimate nominee?
Well, you know, fortunately for the Republican Party this year, probably anybody up here could probably beat Obama. So the challenge isn't all that great on how we're going to beat Obama. I think he's beating himself. I think really the question is what do we have to offer? And I have something different to offer. I emphasize civil liberties. I emphasize a pro-American foreign policy, which is a lot different than policemen of the world. I emphasize, you know, monetary policy and these things that the other candidates don't talk about. But I think the important thing is the philosophy I'm talking about is the Constitution and freedom. And that brings people together. It brings independence in the fold, and it brings Democrats over on some of these issues. So therefore, I see this philosophy as being very electable because it's an American philosophy. It's the rule of law, and it means that, you know, we ought to balance the budget. It opens up the door for saying, supporting my willingness to cut $1 trillion out of the budget the first year. The main problem we have is the government's too big and the debt is too big, and you have to cut spending. So you have to get people to come together. They've been coming together to increase the spending for decades. We have to get them to come together to do the opposite. But there are two factions up there. One want welfare and the other want warfare around the world and policing the world. So you go to the people who like the warfare and say, give me half of the cuts that have to be in the welfare. Go to the welfare people and say, you give me the cuts to cut the overseas warfare spending, and bring people together and live up to what they say. It's the worst kind of economy. You know, pure private enterprise, more closely probably what Governor Romney is involved with, but if it's government-sponsored, it's a mixture of business and government. It's very, very dangerous. Some people say if it goes to extreme, it becomes fascism, because big business and big government get together. So yes, they get money, and I was talking about that for a long time, the line of credit, the excessive credit from the Federal Reserve, the Community Reinvestment Act. For 10 years or so, the Austrian economists knew there was a bubble, and at this time, nobody was listening or doing anything in the Congress. And then to go to work for them and get money from them, it literally is it's literally coming from the taxpayer. They went broke. We had to bail them out. So indirectly, that was money that he ended up getting. They're still getting money from us. Government-sponsored enterprise. It's not a free market enterprise.
Haven't you contributed to that spending problem yourself, sir, supporting over the years earmarks that have benefited your district and your state? Back in 2009, you explained this by saying, if I can give my district any money back, I encourage that. I don't think that the federal government should be doing it, but if they're going to allot the money, I have a responsibility to represent my people. Isn't that what they call a mixed message, Congressman?
Well, it's a mixed question. This is a problem, because the real message is you should include in your question, also, you have never voted once for an earmark. No, it's a principle that I deal with, because if the government takes money from you and you fill out your tax form, you take your deductions. I look at that the same way in our communities. They take our money, they take our highway funds, and we have every right to apply for them to come back. Matter of fact, it's a bigger principle for me than that. I think this whole thing is out of control on the earmarks, because I think the Congress has an obligation to earmark every penny, not to deliver that power to the executive branch. What happens when you don't vote for the earmarks, it goes into the slush fund, the executive branch spends the money, then you have to grovel to the executive branch and beg and plead and say, oh, please return my highway funds to me. So it's this whole principle of budgeting that is messed up, but I never vote
I never voted for an earmark, but I do argue the case for the people I represent to try to get their money back if at all possible.
But isn't that the same thing of having your cake and eating it too? You can complain about earmarks, but then if there are provisions there that help your district or your state, that's different. If 434 other members felt the same way, how would we ever fix the problem?
Yeah, but you're missing the point. I don't complain about earmarks because it's the principle of the Congress meeting their obligation. But if everybody did what I did, there would be no earmarks. The budget would be balanced and we'd be cutting about 80% of the spending. So that would be the solution. But you also want to protect the process. You want to emphasize the responsibility of the Congress in not delivering more power to the president. I would be a different kind of president. I wouldn't be looking for more power. Everybody wants to be a powerful executive and run things. I, as a president, wouldn't want to run the world. I don't want to police individual activities and their lifestyle, and I don't want to run the economy. So that's like an entirely different philosophy, but it's very, very much in our tradition and in the tradition of our Constitution. But I really question this idea that the Congress could subpoena judges and bring them before us. That's a real affront to the separation of the powers. From my viewpoint, they're all good and they're all bad because our country a long time ago split freedom up into two pieces: personal liberty and economic liberty. And the judges, as is the Congress, as a nation, think it's two issues. It's but one issue, so therefore Congress is split on this issue as well as our judges.
Last chance to say.
So I would say that the greatest danger is overreacting. There is no evidence that they have it, and it would make more sense if we lived through the Cold War, which we did, with 30,000 missiles pointed at us. We ought to really sit back and think and not jump the gun and believe that we are going to be attacked. That's how we got into that useless war in Iraq and lost so much in Iraq. So that's an understanding. So the fact that they are surrounded, they have a desire. And how do we treat people when they have a nuclear weapon? With a lot more respect. What did we do with Libya? We talked to them, we talked them out of their nuclear weapon, and then we killed them. So it makes more sense to work with people. And the whole thing is that nuclear weapons are loaded over there. Pakistan and India, Israel has 300 of them. We have our ships there. We got to get it in a proper context. Right. We don't need another war. What is the whole world about the drone being in Iran? And we're begging and pleading, and how are we going to start a war to get this drone back? Why were we flying the drone over Iran? Why do we have to bomb so many countries? Why are we have 900 bases, 130 countries, and we're totally bankrupt? How are you going to rebuild a military when we have no money? How are we going to take care of the people? And we need a strong national defense, and we need to only go to war with a declaration of war and just carelessly flouting it and starting these wars so often.
Speaker,
took my time, so I'd like to finish. If she thinks we live in a dangerous world, she ought to think back when I was drafted in 1962 with the nuclear missiles in Cuba. And Kennedy calls Khrushchev and talks to him and talks him out of this, and we don't have a nuclear exchange. And you're trying to dramatize this, that we have to go and treat Iran like we've treated Iraq and kill 1 million Iraqis, and 8,000 some Americans have died since we've gone to war. You cannot solve these problems with war. You can solve the problems if we follow our Constitution, go to war, only when we declare the war, go in and win them and get them over with, instead of this endless fighting and this endless attitude that we have enemy all around the world. Well, you know, the media has a responsibility and we have a responsibility, and I think exposing our opponents to what they believe in and their flip-flops. I think the reason maybe that we had to do more this year is maybe the media is messing up and they haven't asked enough questions, so we have to fill in and ask these questions and get this information out. So, no, I think it's a responsibility on us. I think there should be lines drawn. I think there are some things below the belt. I don't think, but I don't like the demagoguing, the distortion, and taking things out of context. I don't like that. But when they disagree on an issue, important issues, then we should expose. I think people who don't serve when they could and they get 3 or 4 or even 5 deferments aren't. They have no right to send our kids off to war and not be even against the wars that we have. I'm trying to stop the wars, but at least, you know, I went when they called me up. But you know, the veterans problem is a big one. We have hundreds of thousands coming back from these wars that were undeclared, they were unnecessary, they haven't been won, they're unwinnable. We have hundreds of thousands looking for care. And we have an epidemic of suicide coming back. And so many have, I mean, if you add up all the contractors and all the wars going on in Afghanistan and in Iraq, we've lost 8,500 Americans and severe injuries over 40,000. And these are undeclared wars. So Rick keeps saying you don't want this libertarian stuff, but what I'm talking about, I don't bring up the word, you do, but I talk about the Constitution. The Constitution has rules, and I don't like it when we send our kids off to fight these wars, and when those individuals didn't go themselves, and then come up and when they're asked, they say, oh, I don't think one person could have made a difference. I have a pet peeve that annoys me to a great deal, because when I see these young men coming back, my heart weeps for them. More importantly, you ought to ask me what my relationship is for racial relationships. And one of my heroes is Martin Luther King, because he practiced the libertarian principle of peaceful resistance and peaceful civil disobedience, as did Rosa Parks did. But also, I'm the only one up here and the only one in the Democratic Party that understands true racism in this country. It's in the judicial system, and it has to do with enforcing the drug laws. Look at the percentages. The percentage of people who use drugs are about the same with blacks and whites, and yet the blacks are arrested way disproportionately. They're prosecuted in prison way disproportionately. They get the death penalty way disproportionately. How many times have you seen a white rich person get the electric chair or get execution? But poor minorities have an injustice, and they have an injustice in war as well, because the minorities suffer more. Even with a draft, they suffer definitely more, and without a draft, they're suffering disproportionately. If we truly want to be concerned about racism, you ought to look at a few of those issues and look at the drug laws, which are being so unfairly enforced. No, I think the Fourth Amendment is very clear. It is explicit in our privacy. You can't go into anybody's house and look at what they have or their papers or any private things without a search warrant. This is why the Patriot Act is wrong, because you have a right of privacy by the Fourth Amendment. As far as selling contraceptives, the Interstate Commerce Clause protects this, because the Interstate Commerce Clause was originally written not to impede trade between the states, but it was written to facilitate trade between the states. So if it's not illegal to import birth control pills from one state to the next, it would be legal to sell birth control pills in that state. I don't think it's that complicated. I think we've made it much more complicated than it should be. Yes, the president is the commander-in-chief, but he's not the king. And that's why we fought a revolution, not to have a king and decide when we go to war. We would have saved ourselves a lot of grief if we only had gone to war in a proper manner. And the proper manner is the people elect congressmen and senators to make a declaration of war, and then we become the commander-in-chief and we make these decisions. But we went into Afghanistan, we went into Iraq, and now we're in Pakistan. We're involved in so many countries. Now they want to move on to Syria, and they can't. There's some in Washington now can't wait till they start bombing Iran. We have to change this whole nature. You know, something happened this week I thought was so encouraging, and it reminds me of how we finally talked to the Chinese. I mean, they had killed 100 million of their own people, but we finally broke the ice by playing ping pong. But today, the American Navy picked up a bunch of fishermen, Iranian fishermen, that had been held by the pirates, and released them. And they were so welcome. It was just a wonderful thing to happen. This is the kind of stuff we should deal with, not putting on sanctions. Sanctions themselves always leads up to war, and that's what we're doing. Eastern Europe is going to be destabilized if they don't have this oil, and this just pushes Iran right into the hands of the Chinese. So our policy may be well intended, but it has a lot of downside, a lot of unintended consequences, and unfortunately blowback. Well, it's to restore America to our freedoms, restore America to our principles, and that is individual liberty and our Constitution and sound money. And in doing that, you have to understand economics. You can't solve any of this economic crisis unless you know where the business cycle comes from and why you have bubbles and why they break. You have to understand that we've had a financial bubble that's been going
gone for 40 years. It's collapsing. Nobody quite recognizes about we're in the midst of a real big correction. And the only way you can get back to growth is you have to liquidate the debt. But instead of liquidating debt, what we've done is the people who build up the debt on Wall Street and the banks, we've had the American taxpayer bail them out. We bought it through the Federal Reserve and through the Treasury, dumped it on the American people. The middle class is now shrinking, and we don't have jobs. But if you're an individual or a businessman, if you're consuming everything you're earning just to finance your debt, you can't have growth. So we have to liquidate debt. This is the reason I call for cutting spending. The only one that's calling for real cuts. You have to have real cuts. That's what the Republican Party used to stand for. But you can't liquidate debt. You can't keep bailing out the debt. That's what Japan has done for 20 years, and they're still in their doldrums. We did it in the Depression. We're into this now for 5 years, and it has to end. It's only going to end until after we understand the business cycle. I don't see how we can have anybody really compete with Obama who doesn't challenge this huge empire we have overseas and the overseas spending. I mean, this is how nations come down, is they extend themselves too far overseas. That's how the Soviets came down. We really have to talk about real cuts, and we haven't gotten around to this yet. So if we want to change things, this is what we have to talk about. Character is important, and motivation is important, our history is important, but I really consider that in the debate format to be less significant than what we really believe in.
You have actually sponsored 620 measures. Only 4 made it to a vote on the House floor, and only 1 has been signed into law.
You know, that demonstrates how much out of touch the U.S. government and the U.S. Congress is with the American people, because I'm supporting things that help the American people. That's the disgust that people have because they keep growing government, whether it's the Republicans in charge or the Democrats in charge. But as far as working with other groups, I think my record is about as good as anybody's, because I work on the principle that freedom and the Constitution bring people together for different reasons. People use freedom in different ways, like it does. It invites variations in our religious beliefs, in economic beliefs. We tell people that they're allowed to, to spend their money as they choose. On civil liberties, that's a different segment. Republican conservatives aren't all that well known for protecting privacy and personal liberties. And when it comes to this spending overseas, I can work a coalition. Matter of fact, my $1 trillion proposal to cut spending doesn't immediately deal with Social Security. It's to try to work our way out of Social Security. I'm cutting $1 trillion by attacking overseas spending and going back to '06 budget. And I do not believe that you have to have pain. People who have gotten special privileges and bailouts from the government, they may get the pain, but the American people, if they get their freedom back and get no income tax, they don't suffer any pain.
You're right. He's never really passed anything of any import. And one of the reasons people like Congressman Paul is his economic plan. He's never been able to accomplish any of that.
It's not exactly a simple task to repeal approximately 100 years of us sliding away from our republic and still running a foreign policy of Woodrow Wilson, trying to make the world safe for democracy. And look, we have elections overseas and we don't even accept the elections. No, change in foreign policy is significant, but that's where a nation will come down if they keep doing this. We can't stay in 130 countries, get involved in nation building. We cannot have 900 bases overseas. We have to change policy. What about changing monetary policy? Yes, we do, but we've had that for 100 years, and right now we're winning that battle. The American people now agree. About 75% of the American people now say we ought to audit the Federal Reserve, find out what they're doing, and who are their friends that they're bailing out constantly. But we need to talk, supply and demand. Everybody knows about supply and demand. They talk about oil, and if we had more alternative sources, that we always hope the prices will go down. But everybody forgets that there's 50% of a transaction is the monetary unit, and you don't deal, very few people talk about the supply and demand of money. And when you create a lot of money, prices go up. So it goes up in the areas where government most gets involved, in education and medical care, housing. and in energy. So prices go up much faster than any other place. So if you subsidize somebody and you print money to do it, you compound the problem. It's good politics. Yeah, I'm going to subsidize you and take care of you, but it's bad economic policy, and it's not a good way to find any answers.
In your opinion, what services are all Americans entitled to expect to get from government?
Entitlements are not rights. Rights mean you have a right. Rights mean you have a right to your life, and you have a right to your liberty, and you should have a right to keep the fruits of your labor. And this is quite a bit different, but earlier on there was a little discussion here about gay rights. I, in a way, don't like to use those terms, gay rights, women's rights, minority rights, religious rights. There's only one type of right. It's your right to your liberty. And I think this causes divisiveness when we see people in groups, because for too long we punish groups. So the answer then was let's relieve them by giving them affirmative action. So I think both are wrong. If you think in terms of individuals and protect every single individual, no, they're not entitled. One group isn't entitled to take something from somebody else. And the basic problem here is there's a lot of good intention to help poor people, but guess who gets the entitlements in Washington? The big guys get the rich people. They run the entitlement system, the military-industrial complex, the banking system. Okay. Those are the entitlements we should be dealing with. Was our founders understood what liberty meant, and that is what we need. We have deserted that. We have drifted a long way. It involves our right to our life, right to our liberty. We ought to be able to keep the fruits of our labor. We ought to understand property rights. We ought to understand contract rights. We ought to understand what sound money is all about, and we ought to understand what national defense means. That means defending this country. That is the bully pulpit we need. We need to defend liberty.
Well, they should be abandoned if you're not telling the truth. But if you're exposing a voting record, I think it's quite proper. There was one ad that we used against Senator Santorum, and I only had one problem, is I couldn't get all the things in I wanted to say in 1 minute. But, you know, we mentioned No Child Left Behind, and that he supported deficits ×5, raising the national debt, and that he voted for prescription drug programs, and as well as he voted against right to work. And I could have added, you know, things like he voted for Sarbanes-Oxley. So my only regret is that I couldn't get enough in that 1 minute that I should have. Financial things.
So, Congressman, just to be clear, your plan calls for freezing defense spending at 2006 levels, which is well below where we are today.
You still don't understand.
What's he missing, Congressman?
You don't understand there's a difference between military spending and defense spending. Just because you spend $1 billion on an embassy in Baghdad, bigger than the Vatican, you consider that defense spending. I consider that waste. So now, if you want to... A little while ago, we were talking about, you know, funding the unemployed. Of course, that should be privatized, and I don't support it. But I don't support cutting that off like that. I'd cut some of this military spending, like Eisenhower advised us. Watch out for the military-industrial complex. Defend this country. We have to have a strong national defense, but we don't get strength by diluting ourselves in 900 bases, 130 countries. That is where the problem is. But you need to understand that there's a difference between just military spending and defense spending. Just to spend money. We understand this domestically. If you spend more money domestically, we know it's wrong, but we're supposed to spend more money, and that's conservative. I've never quite understood this. We're supposed to be conservative, spend less money. I'd like to. We should have the lowest tax that we've ever had, and up until 1913 it was 0%. What's so bad about that? Now, I would like to follow up on that, because I think the question on taxes is generally misleading, because anytime you spend money, it's a tax. You might tax, you might borrow, you might inflate. The vicious tax is attacking the American people, the retired people today, is the inflation tax. The devaluation of the currency, the standard of living is going down, and you need to address that. And that's why I want to make the inflation tax 0 as well.
So your answer is 0?
0. Yes, definitely. There is a disparity. It's not that it's my opinion. It's very clear. Blacks and minorities who are involved with drugs are arrested disproportionately. They're tried, they're imprisoned disproportionately. They suffer the consequence of the death penalty disproportionately. Rich white people don't get the death penalty very often. And most of these are victimless crimes. Sometimes people can use drugs and arrested 3 times and never committed a violent act, and they can go to prison for life. And yet we see times, just recently we heard, where actually murderers get out of prison in shorter periods of time. So I think it's way disproportionate. I don't think we can do a whole lot about it. I think there's discrimination in the system, but you have to address the drug war. You know, the drug war is very violent on our borders. We have the immigration problem, and I'm all for having, tight immigration policies, but we can't ignore the border without looking at the drug war. In the last 5 years, 47,500 people died in the drug war down there. This is a major thing going on, and it unfairly hits the minority. This is one thing I am quite sure that Martin Luther King would be in agreement with me on this. Matter of fact, Martin Luther King would be in agreement with me on the wars as well, because he was a strong opponent to the Vietnam War. So I would say yes, this judicial system is probably one of the worst places where prejudice and discrimination still exists in this country. Obviously no, and that's what I did not say that. Matter of fact, after 9/11, I voted for the authority to go after him. And my frustration was that we didn't go after him. It took us 10 years. We had him trapped at Tora Bora, and I thought we should have trapped him there. I even introduced another resolution on the principle of mark and reprisal to keep our eye on the target rather than getting involved in nation building.
But no respect for international law was the question about the quote that you used in Des Moines.
Well, you know, KSM, his colleague, was in Pakistan, and we communicated, with the government of Pakistan, and they turned him over. And what I suggested there was that if we have no respect for the sovereignty of another nation, that it will lead to disruption of that nation. Here we have a nation that we're bombing constantly, trying to kill people that we consider our enemies. At the same time, we're giving the government of Pakistan billions of dollars. Now there's a civil war going on. The people are mad at us, but yet the government they're getting money from us. And I think it's a deeply flawed policy. But to not go after him, and if I voted for the authority, obviously I think it was proper. But once they waited 10 years, I don't see any reason why they couldn't have done it like they did after Khalid Sheikh Hamad. And that would have been a more proper way. Now, if somebody has somebody in this country, say a Chinese dissident comes over here, we wouldn't endorse the idea, well, they can come over here and bomb us and do whatever. I'm just trying to suggest that respect for other nations' sovereignty, and look at the chaos in Pakistan. Sure. Now, we're at war in Pakistan, but to say that I didn't want him killed and didn't vote for the authority,
I just quoted from your radio.
I'm just suggesting that there are processes that if you can follow and you should do it, there's proper procedures rather than digging bigger holes for ourselves. That's what we have been doing in the Middle East, digging bigger and bigger holes for ourselves, and it's so hard for us to get ourselves out of that mess. Right. And we have a long way to go. We are still in Iraq, and that's getting worse, and we're not leaving Afghanistan, and the American people are sick and tired of it. 80% of the American people want us out of there. I'm just suggesting that we work within the rule of law. Like only going to war when you declare the war, then we wouldn't be trapped in
international law. I understand.
Well, I would say that if you do your best and you can't do anything, yes, we had the authority, we voted for it, you got it from the Congress, you do it. I just didn't think that they had gone through the process enough to actually, capture him in a different way. I mean, think about Saddam Hussein. We did that. We captured him. And we tried him. I mean, the government tried him, and he got hung. What's so terrible about this? This whole idea that you can't capture... Just a minute, Brett. Just a minute. What's this whole idea that you can't capture people?
But you voted against the war in Iraq.
Just think, Adolf Eichmann was captured. He was given a trial. What's wrong with capturing people? Why didn't we try to get some information from them? We're accustomed to asking people questions, but all of a sudden, gone. That's it. So I would say that there are different ways without trying to turn it around and say, oh, for some reason, this doesn't mean he's supporting America. Or
Speaker Gingrich.
Like my point is if another country does to us what we do others, we're not going to like it very much. So I would say that maybe we ought to consider a golden rule in foreign policy. Don't do to other nations what we don't want to have them do to us. So we endlessly bomb these countries, and then we wonder why they get upset with us, and yet it continues on and on. I mean, this idea that we can't debate foreign policy, then all we have to do is start another war. I mean, it's warmongering. They're building up for another war against Iran, and people can't wait to get in another war. This country doesn't need another war. We need to quit the ones we're in. We need to save the money and bring our troops home.
Governor Romney.
Just a very brief statement. I, too, served in the Air Force for 5 years during the height of the Cold War from 62 to 68. So I've had a little bit of experience. Matter of fact, I was over in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region. But I would like to point out one thing about the Taliban. The Taliban used to be our allies when we were fighting the Russians. So the Taliban are people who their main goal is to keep foreigners off their land. It's the Al-Qaeda. You can't mix the two. The Al-Qaeda want to come here to kill us. But Taliban just says, we don't want foreigners. We need to understand that, or we can't resolve this problem in the Middle East. We're going to spend a lot of lives and a lot of money for a long time to come.
Kelly.
I need a minute. No, I think we're going in the wrong direction for the protections of our liberties here at home. They're under deep threat. The Patriot Act has eliminated the Fourth Amendment. We now have a policy of preemptive war. You don't have to declare war, and you don't even have to have an enemy. We can start the wars. That's what preemptive war is all about. Now, with the Military Appropriation Defense Act, this is major. This says that the military can arrest an American citizen for under suspicion, and he can be held indefinitely without habeas corpus and denied a lawyer indefinitely, even in a prison here. Let me give you one statistic. You're worrying about all these, where we're going to try people, where are they going to do? We have to do it secretly because our rule of law is so flawed. We have arrested 362 people related to Al-Qaeda top operation. 260 of them are in prison. They've been tried and convicted. So don't give up on our American judicial system so easily, I beg of you. Thank you very much. It's great to be here tonight. I'm a congressman from Texas. I've been elected for 12 times, and also I practiced OBGYN for a 30-year period. I've also served 5 years in the military, and I'm the only U.S. veteran on this stage tonight, because sometimes they're not based on facts, and we suffer the consequences. You know, sometimes it reminds me of this idea of getting corporations out of running campaigns, but what about the corporations that run the media? I mean, they're always in charge. And I think our responsibility, since sorting facts and fiction, the people have to sort this out. But I think setting standards are very important, and I'm very proud that my wife of 54 years is with me tonight. Well, most of the things the federal government could do to get us back to work is get out of the way. I'd like to name. I'd like to see the federal government have a sound currency. That creates a healthy economy. I would like to see massive reduction of regulations. I would like to see income tax reduced to near zero as possible. And that is what we have to do. We have to get the government out of the way. We have to recognize why we have unemployment. And it comes because we have a deeply flawed financial system that causes financial bubbles. The bubbles burst and you have the unemployment. Now, the most important thing to get over that hump that was created artificially by bad economic policies is to allow the correction to occur. You have to get rid of the excessive debt. You have to get rid of the malinvestment. And you don't do that by buying the debt off the people who were benefiting from it. So we, the people, shouldn't be stuffed
stuck with these debts on these mortgage derivatives and all. We need to get that behind us, which means the government shouldn't be doing any bailout. So most of the things to improve the environment is getting the government out of the way and enforce contract laws and enforce bankruptcy laws to some degree, but you really want to make the environment, the economy healthy for everybody and not designate special places. But to help them out to come back is probably necessary on some occasions now. But we have to think about how serious our problems are here, because we faced something much, much greater after World War II. We had 10 million came home all at once. But what did we do then? There were some of the liberals back then that said, oh, we have to have more work programs and do this and that, and they thought they would have to, do everything conceivable for those 10 million. They never got around to it because they came home so quickly. But you know what the government did? They cut the budget by 60%. They cut taxes by 30%. By that time, the debt had been liquidated, and everybody went back to work again. You didn't need any special programs. So one thing, talking about concern about the military and the veterans, I'm very proud that, I get twice as many donations from the active military people than all the rest put together. So I am very concerned about them. I think where the real problem is we can create a healthy economic environment if we did the right things. But where the veterans really deserve help, both as a physician and as a congressman, is the people who come back and aren't doing well health-wise. They need a lot more help. We have an epidemic now of suicide of our military coming back. So they need a lot of medical help, and I think they come up short-changed. They came up short-changed after Vietnam War, Persian Gulf War, and even now. They don't get care from the Veterans Administration. I thought maybe you were prejudiced against doctors and a doctor that practiced medicine in the military or something. No, I want to address the question. The gentleman asked whether he thinks we can repeal Obamacare. Theoretically, we can. The likelihood isn't all that good. We can diminish some of the effect, but I'm more concerned about a bigger picture of what's happening, and that is government involvement in medicine. I had the privilege of practicing medicine in the early 60s before we had any government, and it worked rather well, and there was nobody out in the street suffering with no medical care. But Medicare and Medicaid came in, and it just expanded. But even when we had the chance to cut back on it, when we had a Republican Congress and a Republican president, we gave him prescription drug programs. Senator Santorum supported it. That's expanding the government. So it's endless, and most of them are bankrupt. Prescription drugs, they're not going to be financed. Medicare is not financeable. Medicaid's in trouble. But nobody talks about where the money's going to come from. Now, even in my budget proposal, which is very, very tough because I'm going to cut $1 trillion the first year, but I try to really, even though these programs should have never started, but a lot of people are dependent on, I want to try to protect the people who are dependent on medical care. Now, where does the money come? My suggestion is look at some of the overseas spending that we don't need to be doing. We have troops in Korea since the Korean War, in Japan since World War II, in Germany since World War II. Those are subsidies to these countries. And we keep fighting these wars that don't need to be fought. They're undeclared. They never end. Newt pointed out, World War II was won in less than 4 years. Afghanistan, we're there for 10 years. Nobody says, where's the money come? We could work our way out of here and take care of these people with these medical needs, but we can't do it with the current philosophy of the government taking care of everybody forever on medical care, cradle to grave, and being the policeman of the world. We will get rid of all this government program. Unfortunately, because we're going bankrupt and you're going to have runaway inflation and our checks are going to bounce, and that's going to be a lot worse problem than we're facing tonight. Well, I hadn't thought it through. I don't have an intention of doing it, but for a different reason. I'd probably be embarrassed to put my financial statement up against their income, and I don't want to be embarrassed because I don't have a greater income. Now, I mean, it may come to that, but right now I have no intention of doing that. I think with our financial statements, congressional financial statements, I think you know more about me than I know about myself. That's how my wife found out so much about what we were doing, from my financial statement. Now, I don't think people need that because nobody's challenging me because I have no conflict of interest and I don't even talk to lobbyists and I don't take that kind of money. So there's no conflict. I was the first Republican to sign on with a host of Democrats to oppose this law. And we have had a concerted effort, and I feel like we're making achievement there. This bill is not going to pass, but watch out for the next one. And I am pleased that the attitude is sort of mellowed up here because the Republicans, unfortunately, have been on the wrong side of this issue. And this is a good example on why it's good to have somebody that can look at civil liberties and work with coalitions and bring people together. Freedom and the Constitution bring factions together. I think this is a good example. I can't think of any one thing that I would do differently, but I would continue to do what I'm always trying to do. One thing that I believe about a free society is it provides the opportunity for us to work for our own virtue and excellence. And in campaigning, I think I can still learn a lot about becoming a better deliverer of a message. And the conviction I have, but I think if I spoke a little slower and made more conviction, that I could do a better job. So I think in general, I will continue to work on delivering a message, which I think is a great message. I don't believe you should be, because I think those laws are misdirected. That makes you the policeman, or the businessman the policeman, or the Catholic Church the policeman if they do anything to help an illegal immigrant. It should be the law enforcers, and that is the border guards and the federal government's in charge of immigration. So no, I don't agree with those laws, but that doesn't mean that I'm soft in the issue of illegal immigration. Illegal, I can't imagine anybody standing up here and say, oh, I'm for illegal immigration. We're all against illegal immigration. But I think what we fail to do is look at the incentives. And it has a lot to do with economics. There's an economic incentive for them to come, for immigrants to come. But there's also an incentive for some of our people in this country not to take a job that's a low-paying job. You're not supposed to say that, but that is true. But there's also an economic incentive in the welfare state for immigrants to come in. In Texas, we suffer from the fact that there are federal mandates that we have to take care of their medical needs and their educational needs, and it bankrupts some of our school districts and our hospitals. So it's those mandates. But we need a more generous immigration policy. It should be legal, but we need more resources. But I find that the resources are all overseas. When I was in the military, I was on the Pakistan-Afghanistan border, and that is a no man's land. You can't see the border. At least we can see the river south of Texas. We know where the Rio Grande is. Over there, we can't see it. But we're over there fighting and dying over that border, looking for problems. Why don't we take those resources and quit pretending we can defend those borders and put them on our borders and take care of our needs here?
They want you in on this issue. Would you like in on this issue?
But John, once again, it's a medical subject, and I'm a doctor, No, I do want to make a couple comments, because I can remember the very early years studying obstetrics, and I was told, and it was before the age of abortion, and I was told, taking care of a woman that's pregnant, you have 2 patients. And I think that solves a lot of the problem about, when life begins and all. But I also experienced a time later on in my training in the 1960s when the culture was changing. The Vietnam War was going on, the drugs were there, and pornography came in, and abortion became prevalent even though it was illegal. So the morality of the country changed, but then the law followed up. When the morality changed, it will reflect on the laws. The law is very important. We should have these laws, but law will not correct the basic problem, and that's the morality of the people that we must do. Now, just very, very briefly, I want to talk a little bit about that funding, because the flaw there is if you send funding out and you say, well, you can have it for birth control but not for abortion, all funds are fungible. Even funds that go to any hospital, if you say, well, it's not for birth control and it's not for Planned Parenthood, it's not for abortion, if you send it to the hospital,
They can still use that money. This is an indictment of government-run medicine because you never can sort that all out. You need the government out of that business, or you will always argue over who's paying what bills.
Quickly, sir.
Well, just for the record, I wasn't even thinking about you when I was giving my statement, so you are overly sensitive. But it is true that we have a disagreement on how we approach it. I followed what my understanding is of the Constitution, and it does allow for the states to deal with difficult problems. Matter of fact, it allows the states to deal with almost all the problems if you look at it. It is not given, these powers aren't given to the Congress. I see abortion as a violent act. All other violence is handled by the states. Murder, burglary, violence, that's a state issue. So don't try to say that I'm less pro-life because I want to be particular about the way we do it and allow the states the prerogative. This is the solution. This is the solution, because if we would allow the states to write their laws, take away the jurisdiction by a majority vote in the Congress, you repeal Roe versus Wade overnight instead of waiting year after year to change the court system.
Well, I've done a lot of that in my lifetime.
I should be more specific. Will you run as a third-party candidate?
I have no plans to do that, no intention, and when I've been pressed on it, they asked me why, and I said I don't want to, but I haven't been an absolutist. When I left Congress, I didn't have many plans on going back, but I did after 12 years. I went back to medicine. So no, I don't have any plans to do that, no.
Would you support a Newt Gingrich as nominee of the GOP?
Well, you know, he keeps hinting about attacking the Fed, and he talks about gold. Now, if I could just change him on foreign policy, we might be able to talk business. Well, the government owes them a free market and a sound monetary system, but they didn't give it to them. They gave them a mess. They gave them a financial system that literally created this problem. And it was compounded. First, the line of credit to the Federal Reserve. It was excessive. Everybody now admits in Washington interest rates were kept too low too long. But not only that, in addition to that, it was an insult to injury because they kept interest rates especially low with Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, and there was a line of credit there, and it was a guarantee. Matter of fact, I had introduced legislation 10 years before the bubble burst to eliminate that line of credit. But then the Community Reinvestment Act added more fuel to it, you know, forcing banks to make loans that are risky loans. So the whole bubble was easily seen. The consequences were anticipated. It was all government manufactured. But the question is what do you do after you come upon a mess that the government and the politicians created? The best thing you can do is get out of the way, because you want the prices to come down so that people will start buying them again. But politicians can't allow that to happen. Our policies in Washington still has been to try to stimulate houses and keep prices up. But this whole thing about how we get involved in this low interest rate to stimulate the economy, almost everybody in Washington now, in almost all spectrums of the economic sphere, do not believe in wage and price controls, but they believe in controlling interest rates. That's one half of the whole economy, and here we have a bunch of guys getting in a room in secret deciding what interest rates should be, and they create this mess. So yes, we need to get out of the way, but instead the debt has to be liquidated. The mortgage derivatives was a monster. A lot of people made a lot of money on that, but guess what? Federal Reserve, to the tune of trillions and trillions of dollars, as well as TARP funds, were used to bail out the people that made all this money. Guess what happened to the bad debt that should have been wiped off the book? They should have gone bankrupt. It was dumped on the taxpayers. And the taxpayers still have it. And as long as you maintain that debt on the books, you're not going to have growth. This is why Japan hasn't recovered. We're in 4 years now, and it's going to continue until we understand who creates the business cycle, how it happens, and what you have to do to get out of it. I have a little bit of work to do yet on him on foreign policy. No, I would do pretty much the opposite. I don't like the isolationism of not talking to people. I was drafted in 1962 at the height of the Cold War when the missiles were in Cuba. And the Cold War is over. And I think we propped up Castro for 40-some years because we put on these sanctions, and this only used us as the scapegoat. He could always say anything wrong is the United States' fault. But I think it's time to quit this isolation business of not talking to people. We talked to the Soviets, we talked to the Chinese, and we opened up trade. We're not killing each other now. We fought with the Vietnamese for a long time. We finally gave up, started talking to them. Now we trade with them. I don't know why the Cuban people should be so intimidated. Brett, I don't know where you get this assumption that all of a sudden all the Cubans that come over here, I would thought they were going to celebrate and they're going to have a lot more freedom if we would only open up our doors and say, we want to talk to you and trade with you and come visit. Sometimes they can't even send packages down there. I think we're living in the dark ages when we can't even talk to the Cuban people. I think it's not 1962 anymore, and we don't have to use force and intimidation and overthrow in governments. I just don't think that's going to work. We're blockading them. Can you imagine what we would do if somebody blockaded the Gulf of Mexico? That would be an act of war. So the act of war has already been committed, and this is a retaliation. But besides, there's no interest whatsoever for Iran to close the Straits of Hormuz. I mean, they need it as much as we do. I mean, so you have to put that in a perspective. But this whole idea that we have to go to war because we've already committed an act by blockading the country, and I don't see. And I think Newt is right. I think he's wrong about World War II. I think the people were ready because we did it properly and we declared it and we won it quickly. But no, the people are not ready. We don't have any money. We have too many wars. The people want to come home, and they certainly don't want a hot war in Iran right now. And I think that would be the most foolish thing in the world to do right now is take on Iran. My answer is similar, but a little bit different, because at the national level, obviously, we have to have one language. I mean, we can't have multiple languages. So for legal reasons, we would have one language. But our system really gives us a way to be more generous, because if Florida wanted to have some ballots in Spanish, I certainly wouldn't support a federal law that would prohibit Florida from accommodating, a city election or a local election or a state election. I think that's the magnificence of our system, where you can solve some of these problems without dictating one answer for all states. But nationally, we should have one language. Well, I think the problem is nobody's defined what being conservative means. And I think that is our problem. Conservative means we have smaller government and more liberty. And yet, if you ask what have we done, I think we've lost our way completely. Our rhetoric is still pretty good. But when we get in charge, we expand the government. You talk about Dodd-Frank, but we gave them Sarbanes-Oxley. We gave debts as well, when we're in charge. So if it means limited government, you have to ask a basic question: what should the role of government be? The founders asked that question, had a revolution, wrote a constitution, and they said the role of government ought to be to protect liberty. It's not to run a welfare state, and not to be the policeman of the world. And so if you're conservative, how can you be conservative and cut food stamps, but you won't cut spending overseas? There's not a nickel or penny that anybody will cut on the conservative side overseas spending, and we don't have the money. They're willing to start more wars. So I say, if you're conservative, you want small government across the board, especially in personal liberty. What's wrong with having the government out of our personal lives? So this is what we have to decide: what conservative means, what limited government means. And I have a simple suggestion. We have a pretty good guide, and if we follow the Constitution, government would be very small, and we would all be devoted conservative. And you might add Cuba, too. I think we'd be a lot better off with Cuba, trading with Cuba. So I think the more you can do to promote this free trade, the better off we'll be. But as far as us having an obligation, a military or a financial obligation to go down and dictate to them what government they should have, I don't like that idea. I would work with the people, encourage free trade, and try to set a standard here where countries in Central America or South America or any place in the world would want to emulate us and set the standards that we have. Unfortunately, sometimes we slip up on our standards, and we go around the world and we try to force ourselves on others. I don't think the nations in South America and Central America necessarily want us to come down there and dictate which government they should have. And yet I believe with friendship and trade, you can have a lot of influence, and I strongly believe that it's time we have friendship and trade with Cuba. The question is, what are we going to do about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac? It should have been auctioned off right after the crash came. It would have been cleansed by now. It should have been sold. But maybe it's my physician background, but I think an ounce of prevention is what we ought to talk about, so we quit doing this. But we know how the bubble came about. It was excessive credit, interest rates held too low, too long, the Federal Reserve responsible for that. Community Reinvestment Act, which is affirmative action telling banks they have to make these risky loans. At the same time, there was a line of credit which allowed Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to, to make more money, and it was assumed that they would always be protected. Now, you can't argue. I've talked a long time about cutting off that credit from the Fed. I was trying to prevent this stuff. Also, I opposed Community Reinvestment Act, as well as I had legislation in 10 years before the bus came to remove that line of credit to the Fed, to the Treasury. So,
are you with Ronald Reagan as far as the tax rates, as Senator Santorum has suggested, Congressman Paul?
No, he taxed too much. My goal is to get rid of the 16th Amendment, and the only way you can do that is not run a welfare system and a warfare system and policing the world. But I do want to address this subject about taxing the rich. That is not a solution. But I understand and really empathize with the people who talk about the 99 and the 1, because there's a characteristic about what happens when you destroy a currency. There is a transfer of wealth from the middle class to the wealthy, and this has been going on for 40 years. So the middle class is shrinking, they're getting poorer, and they're losing their jobs and they're losing their houses. But Wall Street isn't getting poorer, and they are the ones who are getting the bailout. So we have to address the bailout and the system that favors a certain group over another group. If you don't have sound money and if you have a welfare state, no matter whether the welfare state is designed to help the poor, the welfare system helps the wealthy. And there has been this transfer of wealth. So if we could stop all of these transfers to the wealthy class, but the solution isn't to tax the wealthy. If you give an honest product and the customers buy that product, you deserve to keep that money and earn that money, but there's a big difference between those who earn money and those who rip us off through the government and the monetary system.
Congressman Paul, you're a physician, you're 76 years old, you would be the oldest president of the United States if you were elected. Are you prepared to release your medical records so voters out there know what your health is?
Obviously, because it's about one page, if even that long. But I'm willing to challenge any of these gentlemen up here to a 25-mile bike ride any time of the day in the heat of Texas. And that subject has come up, and sometimes in fun, but sometimes not in fun. But, there are laws against age discrimination, so if you push this too much, you better be careful. Well, I don't think we should go to the moon. I think we maybe should send some politicians up there at times. But I went into the Air Force in 1962 and studied aerospace medicine. Actually had a daydream about maybe becoming the first physician to go into space. That didn't occur, but I see space, the amount of money we spend on space, the only part that I would vote for is for national defense purposes, not to explore the moon and go to Mars. I think that's fantastic. I love those ideas. But I also don't like the idea of building government-business partnerships. If we had a healthy economy and had more Bill Gateses and more Warren Buffetts, the money would be there. It should be privatized. And the people who work in the industry, if you had that, there would be jobs in aerospace. And I just think that we don't need a bigger and newer program. When you think of the people, I mean, health care or something else deserves a lot more priority than going to the moon. So I would be very reluctant. But space technology should be followed up to some degree for national defense purposes, but not just for the fun of it. But the cost is so high. When you pump money into something like housing, prices go up. If you pump money into education, the cost of education goes up. When the government gets involved in medicine, you don't get better care. Cost goes up, and it distorts the economy. It leads to a crisis. But your medical care should go with you. You should get total deduction on it. It would be so much less expensive. It doesn't solve every single problem, but you're suffering from the consequence of way too much government and the cost going up because government has inflated the cost, and we have a government-created recession, and that is a consequence of the business cycle. I think they're all wrong. I think this is a typical result of when you get government involved, because all you're arguing about is which form of government you want. They have way too much confidence in government sorting this out. So I would say there's a much better way, and that is allow the people to make their decisions and not get the government involved. You know, it's only been... when I started medicine, there was no Medicare or Medicaid, and nobody was out in the streets without it. Now people are suffering. You know, all the complaints going on. So the government isn't our solution. So I'm not too happy with this type of debate, trying to blame one versus the other. But most likely, we're going to continue to have this problem unless we straighten out the economy.
I'll give you 30 seconds.
Cut the spending. And they talk about these no programs and all. But how many of the other candidates are willing to cut anything? Right. I'm willing to cut $1 trillion out of the first year. Well, she's been my wife for 54 years, and we're going to have an anniversary on February 1st.
Congratulations.
So, she's the mother of 5 of our children, and she's a grandmother of 18 grandchildren, does an excellent job, and she's also the author of a very famous cookbook, the Ron Paul Cookbook. So, well... I'd ask him what he called about, you know. What was the purpose of his call? No, I would ask him, what can we do to improve relations? Because I wouldn't see them as likely to attack us. When I was drafted in October of '62, that was a different world. I mean, there were nuclear weapons in Cuba. That was a different story. But today, to talk to them and take the call and see what you can work out, helps Castro. It hurts the people, the dissidents, the people who want to overthrow him have always had to be, you know, nationalistic and unified behind the leader. So as well-intended as these sanctions are, they almost inevitably backfire, and they help the dictators and hurt the people. So it's time to change. The Cold War is over. They're not going to invade us, and I just think that a better relationship and trade relationship, so many people, I think I've noticed already, and since I've been talking about this issue the last 4 or 5 years, I think the people have changed their mind. The American people are getting much more open, not nearly as frightened. People, I don't think they see a jihadist under the bed every night, and we have to worry about that. Well, my religious beliefs wouldn't affect him. My religious beliefs affects my character and the way I treat people and the way I live. The only thing that would affect... The only thing that would affect me in the way I operate as a president or a congressman is my oath of office and my promises that I've made to the people. If it is a God-given life and it's your life, you should have the right to run your life as you so choose, as long as you don't hurt other people. This means a lot more tolerance than some would like to give. So that brings people in who are concerned about civil liberties, and all of a sudden, my position undermines Obama completely and totally because the foreign policy is different. He promises to end the wars, but the wars expand. A constitutional foreign policy will end the wars, and if you want somebody to talk about peace and prosperity, it has to be somebody who understands money and a foreign policy and free markets.
Congressman Paul, we begin with you, sir.
I'm Congressman Ron Paul, Congressman from Texas. I am the defender of the Constitution. I'm the champion of liberty. This shows the roadmap to peace and prosperity.
A new television ad that labels him a fake. Why?
Because he's a fake. And the one thing that I think should annoy all Americans is that voting for foreign aid. I mean, just think, their foreign aid packages, they're huge, and when the member votes for it, they don't say, well, this money's going to ABC because I love that country, but it's the principle of the way the government works. You vote for foreign aid because for some weird reason it's supposed to be good for America, but then it goes and helps all our enemies. That's what I disapprove of. You know, that's always a cop-out when you compare yourself to the other members of Congress. The American people are sick and tired of the members of Congress. They get about 9% rating. I don't rate one at the top. If it's spending or on taxes, I'm at the very top because I vote for the least amount of spending and the least amount of taxes, which means that some of the conservative ratings, you have to realize, sometimes conservatives want to spend money too. When it comes to overseas spending, you vote for the foreign aid. Conservatives are quite pleased with spending money overseas, but if you're a strict fiscal conservative and a constitutionalist, you don't vote for that kind of stuff. You know, there's reason for the confusion because because it's all Congress's fault. They're all messed up. They don't know what they're doing in Congress is the real reason. But this whole idea of earmarking is designating how the money is spent. What a lot of people don't understand is if the Congress doesn't say the way the money should be spent, it goes to the executive branch. And that's the bad part. If you were actually cutting, it would make a difference. But you don't want to give more power to the executive branch. Even if I'm president, I don't want more power over that funding. That should be with the people and with the Congress. But earmarking, the reason we get into trouble is the responsibility of Congress. Take your highway funds. We're supposed to pay a user fee. We pay our gasoline tax. We should get our fair share back. But what do? They take the highway funds and other these trust funds, and they spend this money overseas in these wars that we shouldn't be fighting. And then when the highways need building, then you have to go and fight the political system and know who to deal with and maneuver and try to get some of your money back. But if you say you're against the earmarking and fuss and fume over, the answer is vote against the bill. That is what I do. I argue for the case of the responsibility being on the Congress, but it's the responsibility of us who believe in fiscal conservatism to vote against the bill. We need to vote against the spending is what we need to do. You know, that's interesting that when they argue that case. First, I don't like the idea that you have good bailouts and bad bailouts. If bailouts are bad, they're bad, and we shouldn't be doing it. But this argument about maybe one that works, you know, well, now that the bankruptcy or the bailing out of GM worked, I said that's sort of like if a criminal goes out and robs a bank and he's successful, therefore you endorse what he did because he's successful. But you have to rob people. You have to distort the law. The government is supposed to protect contracts. They're not supposed to regulate contracts, and they're not supposed to undermine contracts. And that's what we've been doing. In the housing bubble, we undermine contracts. And this is what we're doing here. So you want to respect the contracts. A lot of people will accuse me of advocating a free market, that there's no regulations. Actually, the regulations are tougher because you have to go through bankruptcy and you have to face up to this. And it isn't like General Motors would be destroyed. Newt made that point there, that there were good parts of General Motors, but politicians can't figure this out. Then they serve the special interest, and then you have labor fighting big business. I opt for the free market and the defense of liberty. That's what we need in this country. Once the government takes over the schools, especially at the federal level, then there's no right position. Then you have to argue which prayer are you allowed to pray, and you get into all the details. The problem is the government's getting involved in things they shouldn't be involved, especially at the federal level. But sort of along the line of the pills creating the immorality, I don't see it that way. I think the immorality creates the problem of wanting to use the pills, so you don't blame the pills. I think it's sort of like the argument, conservatives use the argument all the time about guns. Guns don't kill, criminals kill. So in a way, it's the morality of society that we have to deal with. The pill is there and, you know, it contributes maybe, but the pills can't be blamed for the immorality of our society. You know, and this demonstrates the problem that I'm talking about. There's always an excuse to do this. Now, Title 20, I don't know whether you inferred that I would support Title 20 for abstinence. No, it would cost money as a program. It's not a program of the federal government to get involved in our lives this way. If you want laws like that, maybe to say, but the federal government shouldn't even be spending money on abstinence. That's way too much more. I don't see that in the Constitution anyplace. Probably not, but we can do a better job, and the best way to do it is forget about the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan and deal with our border and put the resources on this border. This is what we need. But we need to change the rules. We reward illegal immigration. They get benefits. Texas hospitals and, you know, schools are going bankrupt. The restraints on the states and Obama's restraints on the states to do with it. Why isn't, if an illegal comes across the border and they go on private property, why isn't that trespassing? And why don't you have the right to stop it?
And a weak economy is always detrimental, too, because of the welfare state. We have welfare at home, and some jobs go begging. We have jobs going begging in this country in the midst of the recession. Has to do with the economy. You can't ignore the economy. But also the welfare state, allowing immigrants to come over and then get the benefits. If you subsidize something, you get more of. So there's a lot we could do and we should do, and certainly this president is not doing a very good job.
Mr. Com, without caveats or explanations, please define yourself using one word and one word only. Congressman Paul?
Consistent. The wars we fight aren't defensive wars, they're offensive war. We're involved in way too much. They're undeclared, they're not declared by the Congress, and so we're in wars that shouldn't be involved. So I don't want even the men to be over there. I don't want women being killed, but I don't want the men being killed in these wars. But because now we have accepted now for 10 years that we're allowed to start war, we call it preemptive war, preventive war. Well, that's an aggressive war. I believe in the Christian just war theory that you have to morally justify the war in defense. Now, if we're defending our country and we need to defend, believe me, men and women will be in combat and defending our country, and that's the way it should be. But when it's an offensive war going where we shouldn't be, that's quite a bit different. So it's the foreign policy that needs examined. You're so determined to go to war. The only thing I plead with you for, if this is the case, is do it properly. Ask the people and ask the Congress for a declaration of war. This is war, and people are going to die, and you've got to get a declaration of war. And just to go and start fighting. But the sanctions are already backfiring, and all that we do is literally doing the opposite. When we're attacked, we all came together. When we attack when we put them under attack, they get together, and it neutralizes that. They rally around their leaders. So what we're doing is literally enhancing the power. Think of the sanctions that we dealt with Castro. 50 years, and Castro is still there. It doesn't work. So I would say a different approach. We need to at least we talked to the Soviets during the Cuban crisis. We at least can talk to somebody who we do not have proof that he has a weapon. Why go to war so carelessly? In fact, Al-Qaeda's had a plan to bog us down in the Middle East and bankrupt this country. That's exactly what they're doing. We've spent $4 trillion of debt in the last 10 years being bogged down in the Middle East. The neoconservatives who now want us to be in Syria, want us to go to Iran and have another war. And we don't have the money. We're already, today, gasoline hit $6 a gallon in Florida. And we don't have the money. So I don't believe I'm going to get the conversion on the moral and the constitutional arguments in the near future. But I'll tell you what, I'm going to win this argument for economic reasons. Just remember when the Soviets left. They left not because we had to fight them. They left because they bankrupted this country, and we better wake up, because that is what we're doing here. We're destroying our currency, and we have a financial crisis on our hands. News going in the right direction, but not far enough. The Constitution is very, very clear. There's no authority for the federal government to be involved in education. There's no prohibition in the Constitution for the states to be involved in education. That's not a bad position, and we can sort things out. But once again, the senators was for No Child Left Behind, but now he's running for president. Now he's running to repeal No Child Left Behind once again. But and he calls this a team sport. He has to go along to get along, and that's the way the team plays. But that's what the problem is with Washington. That's what's been going on for so long. So I don't accept that form of government. I understand it. That is the way it works. You were with the majority, you were the whip, and you organized and got these votes all passed. But I think the obligation of all of us should be the oath of office. We should take it. It shouldn't be the oath to the party. I'm sorry about that. But it isn't the oath to the party. It's the oath to our office to obey the law, and the law is the Constitution. I would say the perpetuation of the myth by the media that I can't win. And the totally ignoring some statistics that showed it to be the opposite. Just recently there was a poll in Iowa, and it matched all the four of us up against Obama. And guess what? I did the very best. So I would say that is the biggest myth. But let me tell you, though, in public perception is one thing,
But when you go around and talk to the American people and we have our rallies, that misconception isn't there. And I think that's the biggest misconception that I have to deal with.